You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. Before we get into any of this month's episode, I have a couple announcements. Cemetery Confessions now has its own perfume oil. That's right, you can also smell like you've spent the afternoon frolicking at the park, as I like to say, or of course, being mournfully contemplative at the cemetery. This is in partnership with Siefenhexe Berlin, and the perfume oil is made with citronella, Peru balsam, sandalwood, peppermint oil, and patchouli in an almond oil base. It is deep, dark, mysterious, with sharp green notes interspersed, distinctly earthy, with crushed leaves and ash notes. I'm really excited about this. It is listed at $13.39 on Etsy. So I will have a link in the show notes right at the top. You can click on and go take a look at it. While you're there, I would also pick up, especially since if you buy something else, you get a discount. Personally, I would pick up the vegan coffin-shaped patchouli soap. I've ordered a few of these in the past, and they are goddamn incredible. After I've used it for showering, my whole body just smells delicious. It's one of my favorite things. Of course, there's plenty of other perfume oils and themed perfume oils like the strawberry switchblade oil. But I'm incredibly excited to have done this collaboration, and I hope you will go pick one of these up. And then the other quick announcement, which I will have more information on at the end of the show, is just to mention I have posted a interview with Ryan Flint of the band WitchHands as a almost 2-hour long episode for Patreon members. We spend a lot of time talking about our relationship with death and the political nature or lack thereof of goth music, and we speak at length about the new WitchHands album, No Gods, No Masters. So I'll have some more details on that, but if you're looking for more Cemetery Confessions content, head over to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions and take a look at the various rewards you can get depending on the tier. And support us, of course. All right, on today's episode, we have special guest Paulo de Jesus, who is a longtime listener of the show. He has a master's in philosophy of cognitive science, a bachelor's in philosophy, and recently obtained his PhD in philosophy. And he's been working with a group of philosophers for a long time, studying neuropsychology, the philosophy of science, experimental psychology, enactivism, anthropology, ontology and metaphysics. But all of that is less important to me as he's a friend of mine. On this episode, we kind of jump right into the deep end, and we're going to be talking about reality, what there is, and how that comes to be. We will be relating this to goth, right? We're going to talk about identity formation and how goths tend to view that process. And we'll talk about the way goth itself forms and how goth is situated historically and culturally and materially and politically. But we're also going to talk a lot about philosophy and different ways of understanding the world apart from modernist ideals and constitutions. Now, I won't get into that too much in the intro, but let me just say that while this may be a more complex topic, we do return to these concepts multiple times from different perspectives to find new ways to think with and through these concepts, as I personally found them counterintuitive initially, especially to what is considered common sense in the Western world. So while we do kind of jump into the deep end, this is also why I love this podcast, because you won't find this kind of discussion connected to subculture, much less goth, anywhere else. Of course, we also have an album review, Sinister Suggestions, and Azzy Bat's All Goth Considered, which this time around includes the likes of A Cloud of Raves, Plague Pits and WitchHands. So again, I will see you on the other side of this interview. But before that happens, let's get some introductions going. So I am your host, Danny Ashes. I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Paulo, let's start by introducing you to the audience. Can you tell us a little about what your origin story is? Where did goth or alternative culture become relevant for you? And what interested you about that community?
Yeah, so thinking about this, I have makes me feel really old, because my history with initially alternative music goes all the way back to the 90s, right in the beginning of the 90s. When I've always been interested in music ever since I can remember. As a child, I was always drawn to music, towards sound. I was always fascinated by sound, and I don't come from a particularly musical family. No one in the family played anything. We had a radio. That's it. But my dad used to like to listen to the radio, and I'd listen to stuff, and I'd often be moved by music. Anyway, in the early 90s, I can't really remember how this happened, but I got interested, or I got into what at the time was called like alternative rock, basically like grunge stuff, initially like Nirvana, Soundgarden, those sorts of things, and then like more alternative rock, like the Pixies, Suede, Smashing Pumpkins, stuff like all those sort of things. I can't really remember how I got into this, but I really got big into this, and because of this interest in this type of music, my friends and I discovered there was a local club close to us that used to have these alternative nights. So I guess I must have been like 15 at the time, 14, 15. We started going to this. I don't know how we managed to get into some of these nights, but we managed to get in. And this is when I first started encountering goth music, because in these nights they would play the more like alternative type stuff, but then you'd hear other things like the Sisters, and you'd hear Susie and the Band. And when I started hearing that, I was completely intrigued and kind of captivated by this type of music, and it's just something that I started to pursue ever since going to those nights. I started pursuing this and developing this particular interest for darker types of music through going to these nights. And the club that we used to go, they used to do alternative nights where they play, mostly alternative stuff, but they'd have like, goth stuff thrown in there. But then they also had goth specific nights. So I started going to those, and it's through going to those nights that I started sort of discovering all this darker types of music. And through there, I kind of also got into electronic industrial music, which kind of really became my obsession. I remember sort of discovering Skinny Puppy. I don't know if you guys are familiar. They do this the back and forth. They have like the regular albums, and they have these back and forth compilations. I remember the first one that I discovered, I bought at the CD shop, is the Back and Forth Volume 2. And I remember going home and listening to this and kind of being just confused by the music, but also enthralled because there's a lot of experimentation going on this. There's like some which are follow very, traditional song structure type, types of sounds, but then there's a lot of experimentation going, and I just couldn't make sense of what I was listening. But at the same time, I was completely intrigued and captivated by this approach to music, and it's just kind of opened my eye to that music could be different, right? So it opened my eyes to experimentation, and kind of eventually, I know it's like something just clicked, and I sort of understood. It's weird to describe, but everything just sort of clicked, like kind of makes sense on a sonic level. And I kind of so for me, Skinny Puppy is kind of very important in my life because it not only steered me down this kind of industrial route, but it also opened doors to exploring like really more abstract, experimental types of music, which I've been sort of just obsessively, into ever since, really. So, sorry, that's a very long, ramble there, but that's how I got into goth and industrial, which I still am. I have been, I guess. In the 2000s, I kind of fell out of love with it in a way, especially like I kind of, there's a point where the whole future pop thing sort of took hold, and it just didn't, I didn't connect with it. And so some reason it pushed me away from that particular style of industrial, but at the same time, it pushed me towards kind of the noisier type stuff. So I got into noise, I got into power electronics, and that dark ambient, and then it was back sort of like in the mid 2010s, around there, that I sort of got back into, and I kind of just into more traditional, what you traditionally considered to be industrial and goth music, especially for your show, and then for You Die, I Die. Because in that time, I kind of really explored sort of, I guess, what I like to think of as like adjacent genres that are sonically similar to what was happening in sort of the more traditional industrial goth, but they don't sort of operate within those circles. So a lot of like more experimental, darker forms of techno, and other forms of music. It's sonically very similar, but this is one thing that's always interested me, is how a lot of music that is sonically similar doesn't always sort of come into contact with what's being played. I guess this has changed and has gradually changed like over the last few years. But I mean, like in the early 2000s, going up to 2010, these genres would never intersect. So they might be quite distinct, although they were sonically similar to my ears anyway.
Yeah. Did you ever dive down into like a future garage rabbit hole around that time?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so
that sounds about right.
Yeah, especially stuff as well. Like things coming from the early dubstep.
Yeah, the early dubstep stuff.
I mean, you very dark, very gritty, very experimental. And I always thought, wow, man, I mean, this stuff could really, I mean, I'm talking about like early 2000s. This is the stuff when it first came out.
Yeah.
And at the time, you'd think like, I'd be surprised that this sort of thing is not being listened to more by people, more, or it's not more well known in industrial and goth circles.
Well, there were, I mean, there was a period of time, I don't remember exactly when it was, but a lot of dubstep breakdowns were getting inserted into industrial music.
Yeah.
They were, though. The dubstep breakdown was also a later.
Yeah, that's
true. Dubstep itself, early dubstep didn't really have a sense of breakdown. It was more dubby in that it was a sort of static ambiance.
Yeah,
exactly.
And then the later interpretations gave it more of that breakdown structure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I got into that backwards, where I heard the popular bands first, and then tried to look up like, oh, where did this come from? What were those bands that were putting out that music? But that does make a lot of sense to me, that you would be into the experimental and like the cut up aspects of industrial and that kind of thing, which maybe points to some of your metaphysical inclinations.
I'd like, I often think about this, and I don't know, it makes sense. Absolutely, it does make sense. Whether it's the case or not, I don't know. But I've always been drawn, this thing is, I've always been drawn to the darker forms of music and more experimental forms of music, right? And I guess that there is some reflection on some of the way that I think about things academically. So yeah, and obviously, Danny, as you know, we had loads of discussions about these sort of things. These sort of things are not easily disentangled.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some of that. I'll give a little bit of a backstory, just to lead into the first question, I guess, because it is relevant, right? So I had made a video in, I think, 2017 about cognitive science and argumentation, and then you contacted me through email, and that kicked off a conversation.
Yeah.
That I know I've said this before, but it fundamentally over time changed the way that I view myself and the world, and I'm very grateful for that. So that whole thing happened a few years after I left Christianity, and so I had spent a lot of time listening to neuroscientists and psychologists and biologists and prominent atheists kind of talk about cognition and the body and the way behavior and the world works through this mechanistic representationalist lens. And I don't need to get into that whole history, but the concepts presented by you were very challenging to wrap my head around, especially coming from a sort of like fundamentalist background and finding a lot of comfort in simple reductionist explanations and linear causal chains and that kind of thing. So that's sort of been infused into the podcast over the years more and more, and sort of the ways that I think about things. And so it's kind of hard to figure out where we should start talking about that. I figured a good place to start might be with something crucial to your understanding of the world, and something that was kind of initially challenging for me to understand, which is the decentering of humans from our understandings of the world, because these anthropocentrisms are so much of an implicit belief that permeates our motivations and behaviors, obviously science, and how we understand being and consciousness, at least in the Western world, right? I guess because it's not that way of thinking isn't implicit to everyone. There are plenty of, as far as I understand it, indigenous cultures and other peoples that take different approaches from the human-centered approach. But if you can maybe talk about where these anthropocentrisms exist in society and why it's important to you to change that perspective.
So, maybe to connect it to what you were saying initially about sort of, how you came to these things in terms of like scientific explanations of cognition. I think that is one place that anthropocentrism exists, is precisely within cognitive science. In that cognition, at least as it's been traditionally explained, has always been, first of all, seen as principally as a human specific property or activity or process or phenomena. And it's one that can be sort of abstracted away from the immediate surroundings. So really, if you want to understand cognition, all you need to do is kind of focus on the brain, right? Some people might say, okay, you need to focus on the brain and the body. And that is implicitly a type of anthropocentrism, because it's placing, the emphasis specifically and solely on the human. So all that is, what is really worthy of studying, specifically in terms of cognition, and I mean, putting aside that there are other people also trying to understand cognition and lower forms of being, a living being. The emphasis is always on the human, right? So there's that. But in the thesis, I do deal with anthropocentrism, and I distinguish two types, right? To kind of one is simply the common sense view, understanding that sort of just sees human as a kind of the apex of creation, right? So, the humans is what's most important. Everything sort of is subsumed under this kind of hierarchical understanding, or
the concept of directional evolution.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one aspect. But then I also draw a kind of a less obvious but equally present and perhaps even more pervasive and insidious notion of anthropocentrism. And that is that we treat, where there's a tendency of humans to treat matter as just a dead and inert, something that is completely passive and kind of a just structure that is either there purely for human consumption or human mastery, right? And so, and this, and I think that is to understand, although this distinction can be problematic, or it has certain aspects of it as problematic, I think it's analytically important, because it points to something, to something that we need to become conscious, or more aware. And there's this fact that matter is not just there for our consumption, right? That matter, there's something more to matter. There's a liveliness to matter, right? That we need to take into account.
So if we're talking about a liveliness to matter, in the past, on specifically the Sound to Subculture episode, we've kind of talked about various ways of understanding the world that aren't based in human-centric understandings or dichotomies, which we can talk about. Specifically, Bruno Latour's actor network theory, about how recognizing the agency of non-human objects brings a new understanding to behaviors in the world and the way that emerges. In your thesis, you reference, I pulled this quote, actually. I'm going to read this real quick, if you don't mind. You reference Karen Barad and say that boundaries and distinctions, quote, are always dependent on complex assemblages of sensing apparatuses, theories, concepts, mathematical description, and diverse observational practices, which are themselves variously entangled with the economic, the social, the political, and the ecological. Humans and non-humans alike therefore partially constitute and are constituted by the interactive processes they participate in. So if we're talking about non-human entities and objects in this different way, and not in an anthropocentric way, how do they participate, I guess, in the bringing forth of these socio-material processes? And then maybe we can talk about some dichotomies after that.
Well, I think, so for me, maybe a bit of a caveat, I'm interested in specificity, right? So I think, it's, our natural tendency is to kind of abstract. And this is, this dialogue cannot but be an abstraction, right? But it's important that we realize that in this abstraction, that it itself constitutes a specific type of specificity, right? And I think this is something that we should always keep in mind. So I think it's good to think in terms of specific cases, right? So, and then kind of build up from there, because the reason, again, because I said to step back, one step back again, is that I don't see what I'm doing as a particular. I don't see it as a theory as such. I also don't see it as the views that I present. I don't see them as sort of theories of reality as such. I think we might touch on this we might touch upon this later, but I think it's important to put that on the table, because it already from the way we're discussing things, it might sound like I am suggesting that there is this theory that I'm presenting an alternative way of representing reality. What I'm interested in is how reality, for now, let's say realities, how they emerge. This relates to your question, I think, because for me, realities always emerge. Again, we have to be specific about what we talk about. If we can, for a second, just speak in the abstract. So that realities always emerge in this kind of complex entanglement of the human and the non-human. And in this regard, say, the human, what it is to be human, what it is to be non-human, is always an effect of broader sort of practices and material socio-political configurations and reconfigurations. So it's very difficult to like what I just said now is quite abstract, right? And that's why I said that I like to think in specificities, because that's when by looking at specific cases, that's when you can get down to how it is that human and non-human are connected, and what the material and socio-political entanglements are, right?
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think you're completely right. I've always struggled to do that. I think you are right, especially for relating and understanding how that works. I think it's very helpful. I've always just been very much of just think abstractly for whatever reason.
No, it's not a don't get me wrong. It's not a kind of a sidestep, swipe at abstraction.
No.
I'm perfect of abstraction. We cannot. I mean, it's an important aspect, but the thing that I'd like to emphasize is that even abstraction has its own mode of specificity, right? The way we're doing right here, we're creating a very specific material configuration that has its own specificity, right?
Right.
And some of this might be transferable, and some of the ideas that we come up here that emerge in this discussion might be transferable and applied to other similar, but they might not. And so this is the thing. So that it's always, so I'm drawing from, STS and actor network theory, and what I take. So there's two camps, and we've discussed this before, in email form. Is that there's, generally speaking, there's two camps. That there's two approaches to actor network theory that can be divided into these two camps. One is one that sees actor network theory as a theory that explains how the social and the reality works, as a kind of representation or a theory of reality. And another camp that sees actor network theory and STS as a kind of sensibility, a kind of a set of different heterogeneous methodologies that help you to kind of get a sense for how it is that realities emerge. Very specific, situated realities. You see, so they're quite different. So that's why you like in the book review that you did, and we discussed how this came up, is that if I remember correctly, in the book review, the authors draw an active and negative theory, but the way they do so is that they make use of it as a theory,
right,
rather than as a methodology and then they go on to they want to supplement it with smart. Oh, I love that. That acronym. Is that what it's called? Smart?
Smashel.
I love that. So it's quite different. There's two different ways of approaching this. So one kind of more readily gives itself to abstraction and to the loss of specificity, while the other is all about specificity. And it's more sensitive to this idea that things might work here, but they might not work over there. It's the same with ideas, right? Some ideas and concepts, they might work here, but they might not work over there as well. And
right,
it's always a negotiation process. Even with ideas and concepts, you take an idea, you want to plot it over there, and sometimes it doesn't quite do the work you want it to do, right?
Right.
But I personally, I like the idea that theories and concepts naturally emerge within specific practices. Right, they have a natural own within very specific contexts, and then once you start, they and then it's kind of a matter of experimentation to see what work they can do or can't do across various contexts and places and situations and so on.
Well, I mean, if I can create a specific situation, maybe even to talk about dichotomies a bit. Would be specifically like what we are doing right now. So I'm talking through a microphone. I have a standing desk, which is something new. So I'm standing instead of sitting. I have water that I'm using. I'm touching my keyboard and things. And there's different ways of looking at that interaction as either these are just simply separate objects that are well. Maybe you can talk through that because you do it better than I would.
Well, no, I think you're doing a perfectly good job. But it's to take a concrete example, the work that I've been working with, which is dichotomies. Okay, again, to go one step back. Sorry,
no, it's good.
Is that when I first started my PhD. And I started working in cognition. I was very interested in undoing dichotomies, and I thought that cognitive science, the problem with cognitive science was largely, the fact that it was grounded on the subject-object dichotomy, right? And if cognitive science wanted to progress, it had to undo that dichotomy and had to kind of, as I've developed my thinking in different ways, I've come to realize, well, not realize, what I've come to be interested in is how it is that those dichotomies and dichotomies like that come about. And again, so we go back to this specificity. So and the work that I done and the work that sort of comes out of my PhD, the final dissertation, is my sort of exploration of how one particular body of work within cognitive science, known as enactivism, how theorists in that field sort of both undo certain types of dichotomy, like the subject-object dichotomy, while at the same time redoing it, right? So in the cases that I look at, these dichotomies are done through specific argumentation and by using specific concepts, right? But they can be done and have been done differently, like in seminars that I have attended, in email discussions that I've had, right? In some of these, they are so the different practices. There are different practices where different types of the dichotomy are enacted. And I looked at sort of textual practices to explore how they, one way and one field by a selected group of theorists, that I've, which I've explored through my work, and how, to try to understand how it is that this is done, right? But taking that sort of, I think the same sort of thing, and this is what I'm interested in, is exploring how, dichotomies can and are done, not just in academia, but in other aspects of life, right? Like I work in psychiatry, that's my day job. Mm-hmm. And in there, we constantly both performing and undoing different types of dichotomy, the mm-hmm. subject-object dichotomy, the kind of, the way we understand patients and the way we relate them within a psychiatric unit, within a psychiatric ward, specifically the one I work in. There are various different practices which enable us to kind of, not only but practice through which we both enact dichotomies and erode them, right? So there's all, and this is why these, for me, I find it useful to speak of these as realities or worlds. They can be misleading, but trying to kind of capture sort of the reality, kind of the concrete realities that are being manifested in one place that kind of directly contradict each other, right? Mm-hmm. And dichotomies are interesting precisely because they kind of directly contradict each other. In one way, you're eroding, you're kind of undoing the dichotomy, and then for other means you're redoing it. And yeah.
And just to clarify, if I see if I get this right or not, for people who don't know, essentially the subject-object dichotomy is the idea that the subject and object are two distinct, maybe ontological domains, that the subject is the thinking agent that acts on the object, and it's not there's no acting in the other direction.
So this kind of ties maybe to the issue of anthropocentrism, because I mean, the subject-object dichotomy, so historically, you can sort of trace it back to kind of, I mean, you can trace it back all the way to the Greeks, but, the advent of modernity is kind of, we see it as a key sort of historical period where kind of these ideas get sort of, I can't say the word, operationalized. You get a broader distinction between nature and culture, mm-hmm. right? So you have nature on one side, and sciences gets assigned the responsibility of looking after nature and speaking on behalf of nature. And then you get culture, and that is, the other side, and, you get other representatives, and they might be the historians and sociologists and psychologists.
The dichotomy between the hard sciences and the soft sciences.
Exactly. That all stems from that initial division between nature and culture, right? And within this division stems all these other dichotomies between epistemology and ontology, the subject, the object. But within these, the subject and the object, they get constructed in very specific ways. So the subject is always, this kind of gets sort of disrupted somewhat at some point in history. But initially, the subject is always seen as the center of agency, and the object is always that which does not have agency. Mm-hmm. So the subject is distinct from the object, and the subject represents, tries to understand or cultivate or tries to master the object. Mm-hmm. The sciences are the masters of nature, right? They try and uncover her secrets, right? So mm-hmm. So the subject and the object get construed in very specific ways, and so this is kind of the heritage, that's filtered through with this initial setting up of these two distinct domains, has sort of filtered through and led to all these various sort of overlapping sort of, at times distinct, but greatly overlapping distinctions that stem from this initial nature-culture dichotomy, one of which is obviously the subject-object.
One thing I think that's interesting about that, from speaking from a historical perspective as well, talking about that subject-object dichotomy and the concept of anthropocentrism is, and also as we were talking about our hierarchical tendencies, while historically we talked about that dichotomy of subject and object, we almost always centered the subject anthropocentrically.
Yeah, exactly.
Human beings are always the subject, and the other is always the object.
Exactly.
And that's that hierarchical aspect that becomes problematic if you take it to extremes.
Exactly. So the advent of modernity is intrinsically anthropocentric, and and the thing is that it's no surprise that the issue of anthropocentrism is so so prominent at the moment, because we're having all the the ecological crisis that we're in, precisely because of this view, right, that treats matter as this passive, non-agential entity, right? And then it all stems, and it has this, it has that, it has this genesis at the birth of modernity, when kind of various practices came into being that proliferated this conception of, of a distinction between nature and culture.
So we're rejecting or recognizing these dichotomies and seeing the world more.
I think,
well, we'll get to that.
Sorry to interrupt. Personally, I'm not rejecting them.
Yes. Yeah.
I would say both questioning or challenging rather than rejecting.
Right. So for the time being, what I'm saying is that, what I've been interested in, rejection is a separate issue, because we're getting into, it's a valid issue. But for now, I think the interest is in how these come about, and not only that they can exist and do exist in certain places, but not others, right?
Right. So let's talk about multiple worlds then, because this again, that's another concept that kind of completely reconfigured how I think about things. Because again, most of us think of the world as pre-given, irreducible, fixed or mechanistic. So from a scientific perspective, through those methodologies, they sort of purport to speak to the fundamental reality of nature itself, or even religious frameworks, like where I came from. So the idea is that the world is out there, it's predetermined, and we can observe and test the world and replicate those tests to determine what the truth is. And it's as you point out, it's a common sense view at this point. So, and what I think is funny is this assumption exists despite another thing you talk about is reflexivity. So, and what it made me think of is this meme that I've seen where it's a picture of Morpheus from the Matrix, and then the text says, "What if I told you that the brain named itself?" Which has that correlation with an activist recognitions that cognition itself is a cognitive process.
Yeah.
You point that out in your thesis, that we think that behavior correlates to a brain region, and that is reflexive, and because it's the brain deciding what the brain is doing. So, I kind of got off track, but let's talk about multiple worlds and ontological multiplicity. If we're not looking through representationalist views and that kind of thing, what does that mean? How does that happen?
Yeah. Again, so what's the best way?
Which I understand there are worlds of representationalist views, which is maybe where you're going with that.
No. Well, I guess something I want to avoid, as I said previously, is the tendency, and this is a specifically philosophical tendency, I think, to want to present like grand sort of theories, a grand narrative, sort of ideas that sort of explain everything. And this is fine, but it's not what I'm interested in, right? And I said earlier that when we're talking about dichotomies, right, I was interested in how they are enacted, right? And by that, I mean like how they are concretely enacted insofar as that they are, they are materialized through so they are situated in a place, they are grounded within specific social political context, and they have a very specific materiality that enables them that to kind of to be first brought into existence and then to stay in existence for a particular type of time, particular duration, right? So be it sort of through an argument, like a face-to-face argument that kind of just lasts, a minute or an hour, through text. So there's a materiality that enables these distinctions to kind of they are not just. In the reason I'm sort of trying to emphasize the materiality is to kind of make note that these are not just beliefs, they're not just mental states, but they are actual particular sort of material. They have a kind of a lively materiality to them that that need work and labor to kind of maintain them in existence, right? You need to enact them into being. You need to do things. You need to recruit materials. You need to organize. You need to structure and restructure. You need to reconfigure the world in very specific ways to enact specific things. And it is this idea that I think as, first of all, I think of it as an ontology. So an ontology is just another word for reality. So it might be worth noting that traditionally in philosophy, the word ontology means just the nature of being. And philosophers have been interested in ontology insofar as they want to give ontology has always been a logos, has been associated with words and discourse, right? So it's always been, so philosophers speak about ontology, they usually speak about what it is that exists in particular sort of conceptual schemes or systems of belief. So, for example, God might exist for you, but it exists for you within your belief system, for example, right? But it's not. So that's traditionally, that's how ontology has been understood. And I sort of, for me, I following a sort of work from STS, I call this a theoretical ontology, sort of, leaning on that logos aspect of ontology. But then,
STS is Science and Technology
not so
Studies,
much
right?
This. Yeah, sorry, science and technology. Yeah, exactly. Sorry about that. Which is emphasizing the materiality. So on the one side, there's emphasis on logos, on concept, on discourse, on theories, on representation. STS is sort of interested on ontology as in the materiality of being, rather than the discourse about being, rather than what it is, how certain beings are materially constituted, right? And for STS and for again, not all STS scholars, but the STS scholars that I'm specifically interested in, I draw from and I kind of try to work with, are scholars that see ontology as a kind of a malleable thing, right? Where traditional in philosophy, philosophers see existence as a kind of singular thing. So things exist in the singular, like you were saying, Danny, as a kind of pre-existing thing. And we have our theories that then theories and categories that trying to capture, this essence of being that exists out there. STS kind of brings us down to earth. It sort of jetsons sort of grand theories, and it kind of tries to focus on the concrete practicalities of what's going on in specific context. So, a school, a concert, a hospital, right? And they see and they investigate how certain things come in and out of being, right? And what it is that constitute. And it's in this sense that particular things, particular entities, particular types of entities exist in different ways, right? And in multiple. So rather than, whereas traditionally you might say that, for example, this entity exists. It has this, it has intrinsic properties, and it can be defined in accordance with these intrinsic properties. This approach sort of tries to see how, in some cases this might be true, but in other cases, entities they are one thing here, but they're a different thing over there. So they exist multiply, and in all these cases, they are multiple because there are multiple practices, material practices, and kind of other extended networks which are often entangled with the social and political, which bring them into being. So here's an example, right? So a bottle of water, right? Here, a bottle of water outside an airport, right? Outside an airport, it's a receptacle that contains a liquid that will quench your thirst, right? You step into the airport, and suddenly this bottle of water becomes something else, right? It becomes a possible device, or a material that can be used as a terrorist, for terrorist means, right? Its ontological status changes from from 1 minute to the next, right? And how does this work is that, it becomes entangled with a different type of practice that constitutes the bottle of water differently. The bottle of water stops being simply a receptacle with a liquid that can quench your thirst, and it becomes it becomes entangled in kind of a broader social political machine that constitutes in this very particular and very distinct object from the same object that you just had, a minute ago, right? And this is what I'd say, I'd call different worlds. The different worlds are being enacted here.
So I guess my question would be specific about that bottle of water example. Its transformation from being a receptacle for a life-sustaining fluid to being a potential bomb.
Yeah.
What in your mind makes that an ontological shift rather than an epistemological shift?
It's not a matter of how you sort of understand the bottle, right? I'm not just representing the bottle differently. I'm not saying, the bottle exists there, and then I'm kind of giving a different perspective, right? That there's a clear ontology in the sense that it becomes entangled with very specific concrete practices that constituted, it is these practices, and within a particular time. And in fact, I think I read, I think it was last week, there's an airport in the UK that suddenly stopped banning, reversed this ban on bottled water, right? So the thing is, these things are they're historic, they're situated, so it plays into a much broader sort of kind of much broader networks that are sort of political and sociological. So these things come in, and they're not just epistemic, right? They're not just about how we know the world, but how the world is made and how properties in those worlds are made, right? We have a concrete materiality. It needs to be practiced into being. These extended networks need to be in place, and they are in place, and they occur in specific places at specific times, right? I think you go back prior to the 9/11, to a specific point in time, and this doesn't happen. The bottle continues to be a bottle, both inside and outside. It continues to be a bottle of water, both inside and outside. But then something happens, but you can see it's not just an episode. It's not a way that you're kind of now trying to understand the bottle, but to really see what's going on, you need to account for the real world practices that need to go into ensuring that this happens, right? That there needs to be guards in place, there needs to be signs. There's a whole machinery that enables this to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the epistemic, it sort of recedes into the background here because it's the material and the practical interventions, the practical situations that really kind of facilitate this transformation.
I guess the only reason I view it as more of an epistemic shift is the danger shift isn't... So the concept of a bottle of water, depending on what you're using to analyze that object in the world, you can know certain things about it. You can look at it and see that it is a bottle that is an understandable shape that's pretty concrete, though, we can get in debates on that, but it's a bottle, but it's filled with a liquid that happens to be transparent. So those are the things that are knowable visually. And as it's outside, you can assume it's a bottle of water, but there's an assumption there. There's a analysis, a form of knowledge about it that isn't necessarily based on explicit physiological components of the object. You're looking at it from a sensory perspective that is limited. And then when you bring it into an airport, that same sensory frame is still limited. You're still seeing a bottle-shaped object containing a translucent fluid, but that translucent fluid can't necessarily be assumed to be water any longer because there's a danger inherent to that assumption if it's not water. But they don't have the tools there to reliably and safely analyze it to say that, yes, that clear substance that is liquid inside this vessel is definitely water. So an assumption about it changes, that form of knowledge about it changes, and that's what makes it dangerous, not something that physically changed in the object and its contents itself, but the limits of our ability to analyze that object and the danger inherent in the gray areas of those limits.
I see what you're saying, but I still think, you see, the way you sort of present, you're drawing a distinction between the epistemic and the ontological. I think they both, they both entangled here, right? Yes, it's true. There's certain, so that's that, and the point is, speaking epistemically, there's a tendency to kind of always kind of revert back, and you kind of, the way you explain sort of indicates this nicely, is that you revert back to the subject and how the subject perceives. Which is fine, but you see, the thing is that there's always a broader, like in the case of the bottle, for example, you see the entanglement between the epistemic and the ontological is really brought to the fore because you realize how those practices and material arrangements and configuration also need to be in place in order for this bottle to be transformed. Right? It's no longer simply a way of, you need broader networks that sustain this particular perception, right? So you need all these other material practices. You need a specific type of political climate, sociological climate, right, which is not reducible to the epistemic. Yes, there's epistemic involved because there's always types of knowledge, but the knowledge, there's a collapse of the epistemic and the ontological, or an entanglement of the two, right?
Yeah, well, there definitely was an explicit, like you say, a political change. I don't remember, because this was in reaction to September 11th, of course, being that big terrorist state, but the water bottle came after that because there was a separate attempt. But so there's a concept that the day before that water bottle attempt, then there was no ontological or epistemological shift between the water bottle outside the airport and the water bottle inside. But the day after that attempt, the whole world changed, and now there is a difference perceived, or an ontological or epistemological difference between the outside versus inside bottle. And it was just a matter of a couple of days transpiring to make that full shift in a world perception of a phenomenon that is substantially the same at those two dates.
Yeah, well, yes, I do agree, but I wouldn't want to say that it's the same. I think there's a broader machinery that sort of comes into play that radically reconfigures not just the perception. This is the thing; it's not just the perception. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is true, but the perception is intrinsically connected to this broader machinery that's now been implemented, and then gradually kind of, gets tuned and retuned, so that the kind of a vast sort of array of things that need to happen, right, for this transformation to occur. So there's this kind of deep, so I think that if you just focus on the perception solely, then you miss out on this broader machinery that's at play, and then helps in this transformation.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a simple fact that perception, as we've already pointed out, is mitigated by a sense-making object.
Yeah, for sure.
Whatever we want to call it. And yes, there may be physiological things that are happening, synapses, neurons, photons being detected by various apparati that we call sensory apparatus, but they're being given sense by the brain, and all the things around it, that environment, both political, sociological, all affect how that sense-making object or sense-making item, whatever you want to term it, interprets what is ostensibly just stimuli.
Right. You see that's I definitely wouldn't want to go down that route. I think this is you present a very specific way of understanding and the subject, which I find problematic, right? Because you reduce the kind of, even though if I understand what you just said correctly, that you're kind of reducing the sense making ultimately to the sensory experience. So in effect, the broader machinery, everything might be there, but it kind of becomes secondary to what's really doing the work, which is the brain, which is, I think, and again, this ties into this multiple ontology things. I think that this is just one way in which the subject and the interaction with the world can be understood and is understood. And there's a science that enacts this understanding of what it is to be a subject and to perceive things. But I think there are others, right? And for me, when I say there are others, I think that rather, against this thing about the epistemic, I want to make what maybe some would consider a stronger claim, saying this is not just an epistemic claim about how it is to represent subjects and the way they go about doing the sensory experience, but a ontological point about what subjects are and how they are variously and differently constituted within different scientific practices. But, we might be going. This might just take us in a completely different entanglement.
Right. I mean, that's kind
you're
of
very quiet.
No, I'm just listening. I understand where Trey is coming from, because it's also
sure. So
how I sort of this also didn't make sense to me, because I was still working through that, and and ultimately you also don't necessarily have to agree, but just to sort of point out the difference in perspective maybe is just sort of viewing again a dichotomous relationship between a reality that is out there, which we then perceive, and there may be, like, the idea is that, well, maybe our perception is flawed, but there's still some irreducible something there. Maybe to kind of better, or to illustrate that in a different way, we could talk about the sort of tools, like the role of tools in research, because that's I think kind of what we're getting at here, in sense making, and the idea that we can point to measurable, reproducible data, which is this solid epistemic ground, but actually when you think through that and the ways that is used, that actually the tools also are part of the bringing forth of the object rather than just objectively perceiving it.
Yeah, that's a very Baradian thing. Although the bringing forth, so is this a terminological sort of point? This notion of bringing forth, I used to use it all the time, and it comes from this tradition in enactivism, this embodied cognitive science and activist, the tradition that I've been working in and through, like, over the last 15 years, I suppose. And they, researchers, they speak of bringing forth. I always like this expression, but I've kind of grown a bit it kind of makes me a bit uncomfortable. I'm not exactly sure why. I prefer to use the term enactment, because I think, for me, this is different with different, I've had this discussion with different people, and they kind of, they don't see where I'm coming. But I mean, for me, enactment sort of points more towards the kind of the materiality of things. We're bringing forth the materiality, the emphasis is not so much. So I'm interested in the materiality of things. So I think enactment, but then enactment also has this, it's used in other ways. It has a more commonsensical understanding or traditional usage, which also sort of, which is to bring into existence, right? But this, and my worry with the bringing forth is, which is something that Danny, you completely, go against in the way you explain things. You bring forth things through materials, through the practices. And this is something that I think that I use with the word enactment as well, so that, you always, even when you're doing science, right? But Barad's point is that she draws this distinction between interaction and interaction. So they say that interaction is our sort of, it presupposes that there is a distinction between the subject and the object. So they wanted to do away with that dichotomy, and they introduced this interaction to sort of highlight, to emphasize the view that any sort of engagement with something is not presupposing this prior distinction, but the engagement in itself, what they call the interaction, is what leads to whatever it is that emerges in the particular process. So in this way, they try to overcome this, a kind of implicit, what they see to be an implicit reliance on this kind of dualistic metaphysics that still, even the people like in cognitive science, for example, who are trying to overcome, the subject-object dichotomy by emphasizing that, there is no such dichotomy because subjects are always interacting with the environment in particular ways. And so in this way, that the distinction between the two is always eroded. Barad argues that even that argument sort of is implicitly sort of grounded on a metaphysics, what they call a metaphysics of individualism. And a metaphysics was presupposes the distinction, because they argue that even though the subject and the object are always interacting, they are kind of preformed before the interactions happen. So in this sense, that they see this as a kind of a reenactment of, the subject-object, even though, theorists will be explicitly arguing against such a dichotomy by emphasizing, interaction. So it's one of these ways in which, you can, there's one route, where one word, interaction, is used to kind of undo a dichotomy, but then on another route, for a different set of arguments, that same word was used to undo, is now argued to be doing exactly what they say they're not doing.
So, okay, let me see if I can apply we can talk more about, there's a lot more we can talk about. Let me see if I can apply some of what we talked about or what we've just been talking about to goth culture in some way, because this is a goth podcast. We haven't gotten to that yet. So the way I was thinking about this is that goths make statements about the nature of goth all the time, such as goth is a music-based subculture, or goth is goth, or goth is a mindset, or we create criteria that one must meet to call themselves a goth. And then the reason for that is the concern I hear from people is they don't want people to think that goth can be whatever anyone wants it to be, that there have to be boundaries like listening to the music, or otherwise anyone can wake up one day and say that they are or aren't goth, and then do the next thing the next day, and so on. And so that's kind of talking about these multiple worlds, right? The socio-material ontology, the way we're enacting goth, and that was also in the Italian goth enactments book that we went through in the past, just for a reference. I think because, right, some of us tend to grasp onto the sense, finding meaning or value in that essentialist mindset where we're inclined towards goth being this essence, or some people might be more inclined towards this idea of an ongoing construction of a thing, sort of like a Butler perspective, or like, as I've argued in the past, I think people are starting to lean that way more because of second order observation and profile building in social media that Dr. Mueller has talked about. There, what you've talked about, there's this collective historical complexity to these communities that partially enables them to exist. But people like to create this idea of a immutable like history as well, which I think creates a sense of comfort, and in some cases even a sense of like superiority if they're arguing about what goth is or isn't. But I think what that creates is, I've seen people ask questions, especially newer goths, ask questions like, how much music do I need to listen to be goth? Or how often do I need to dress goth? Or how much of my wardrobe needs to be black? So it becomes this reductionist quantification thing where, like, if I can't listen to 99% metal and 1% goth, then what's the golden ratio? And who's deciding what that is even? So I have seen people more often these days view goth as something that we make it, rather than something that is like a discrete entity that we act on, or that acts on us. But I still see people argue that, like, we'll say like, well, style is subjective, but music is not, or acknowledge that society and environment have some influence on what goth is, but then also talk about bringing out your true self, which is maybe something we can get into. I do want to point out, there was a really helpful example in your thesis about, let's see if I can pronounce this, atherosclerosis. That I think is applicable here, where you talk about how, on the face of it, it seems like atherosclerosis is a well-defined, cohesive thing. But when you look closer, you see it's enacted differently by different entities. So you explain that this condition is understood as a painful discoloration in the leg in one setting, or as plaque blocking blood vessels in the operation room, or cellular membrane thickening under a microscope. And all of these are true and enacted through very varied material arrangements and interactions. And that reminded me of and I think when they were from Sound to Subculture, when they were talking about chronotopes, they were saying that bringing forth these environments can overlap and interact with each other and be at odds and exclusionary with each other. And so what I'm getting at is that, like, they this thing varies from person to person and place to place, and it's not a concrete. It's that the concrete material practices give rise to different ontologies, and so other than this sort of idea that what's the word, mononaturalist, the like objective pre-given thing, it's not a causal chain of events. It changes and it varies from person to person and history and place, and it's fluid. For me, I think that gives goth more meaning, like to address that fear. I think it gives goth more meaning because we're choosing to continue the practice and discussion sustained over time through these networks, if I'm saying that correctly, or as I understand it, and create these worlds rather than them existing already.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that is precisely what it is, these practices that, as I think this is why goth has had this amazing, lifespan, has been in existence. It's not because there are people that bring it into existence, all these various places, right, in different ways. And in fact, I think this what you're talking about is actually a very generative thing. It's a good thing because it itself brings about new ways to talk about what goth is, and that itself is a practice which helps sustain goth, right? So it continues, and this is for anything to exist, be it a theory, a music genre, it needs to be brought into existence. It needs to work. It needs to practice. It needs to be cultivated in very specific ways. There's a lot of hard work needs to go into these types of practices, for it to exist at all, right? And I think that goth as a subculture is particularly good at this because it enacts it in very, very distinctive, lively ways, right? It brings it into existence in its very particular, vibrant manner, right? And I think this is one of the kind of the beautiful things about goth, is the way it's multiply enacted in all these different places. And of course, some of them are going to be at odds with what some people think it is or it ought to be. This normativity doesn't go away. There's always going to be people who think that no, goth is this, and there's there'll be people disagree. I don't know why I'm telling you guys this, but this is part of what it's part of the kind of that beautiful fabric of goth existence that kind of sustains it as the particular entity that it is in this in these different ways.
So let me ask a couple. Well, let me use a couple different examples to return to think about again multiple worlds and some questions that I have and had, and maybe we'll get a different perspective on this. So the first one was that I was thinking was gender in general, but we've talked about that several times in the past, mostly because I'm genderqueer, but also just because goth in general has always been considered a safe place for gender expression and has been associated with androgyny and gender nonconformity. So, well, I guess I referenced Butler earlier. She more thinks through gender as a performance, as a behavior, kind of all the way down. So it's not what you are, it's what you do. Reality is performed through or sustained through continued performance, and which is slightly different than what we're talking about. But I guess what I'm getting at anyway, though, the question is, if we're talking about multiple worlds and these worlds being, as far as I understand it, equally real for the agents, then does that mean that for someone, gender may actually be binary, while for someone else, gender is not binary? It's a spectrum, or gender doesn't exist for someone else, or that kind of thing. Well, are those all true? Yeah. Or maybe true is the wrong word, but
okay. Yeah. Well, I think definitely this is probably one of the kind of uncomfortable consequences of this way of trying to sort of explore the world, right? And it's precisely that, the fact. But I think I'd phrase things slightly different. You think when we say that it's like gender is binary for some people, it's fluid for some people. This the phrasing of "for some people" makes it sound as if it's like it's simply like a belief system that they have. They believe that gender should be. I think for me, it's something much more than that, right? I think there are worlds, if we can speak in those terms, there are realities that exist which constitute and create gender in these binary terms, just in the way that you, Danny, as a queer, as in the way that you create gender, you are performing and you are creating worlds. It's not just what you believe, but and I don't want to, I'm generalizing here, but there's a materiality to your being, right? There's certain things that you do, there's certain structures that need to be in place and that contribute to this particular type of enactment. And I think, so the uncomfortable thing about this is that all you need to do is just, and right here, you just need to go outside. There are plenty of examples of where gender is being created in these, in these different ways. So in that sense, gender exists and it's real in those particular practices. There are networks that, enacted into being. The networks, again, that are kind of extended, they are political, they're social, cultural, and they kind of, again, a bit like the bot, there's kind of this extended machinery at play that helps, instantiate these particular types of worlds. As I said, there's definitely an uncomfortableness to hearing that, especially if you have a particular persuasion, right, that gender is this or that gender is that, right? Especially if you have very specific preconceived notions or ideas of what it is and shouldn't be. But the fact is, I think that it is being enacted in these ways. You cannot, it's not just about people's beliefs, right? There are very real practices, material arrangements in place perpetuate these types of ways of understanding gender, right? And how gender is performed by people.
So for me along those lines, when it comes to the multiple worlds emerging out of enactments, where I think the difficulty comes in the struggle and the problems as they arise in society is when, those worlds start to collide.
Yeah.
When, one person's enactment, which, enacts a world where gender is fluid, where gender doesn't have these concrete signifiers that divide it into a strict binary, collides with another person's enactment where if this, then this gender, and it has this very strict box. And then there's the whole influence of society as a whole, where, since we're all living within the society and there are aspects of the society that enforce certain worlds on other people by, dividing, say, bathrooms into a binary. You don't have a concept in a lot of society where there's a space for someone who doesn't perceive as a binary. They have to pick one binary because there are two doors that are discrete spaces that they have to go into to perform a basic bodily function. And that's something that's imposed upon someone's world by an external societal force. and those people who are comfortable in that world with the binary have a vested interest in maintaining that power structure, and those people who are uncomfortable with that, or that's a world that endangers their existence or their concept of self, are trying to change that power structure, to change that enactment so that the structure that helps control society is more amenable to their world. And there's a big friction there, not only between the individuals who have disagreeing worlds, but between the overarching society, which gives precedence to a certain world versus another because of some concept of normativity or whatever reasons an individual society decides to try to reinforce a specific world enactment within its populace.
Yeah, I completely, I see where you come, but I think for me, this is precisely why I find the notion of multiple ontologies or multiple worlds liberating, precisely because, if you follow this, it says, it's like a STS slogan, which I love, is that it could be otherwise, right? So multiple ontologies, this idea is inherently political, precisely because you're restructuring reality, right? You're restructuring what the world, how the world is organized, or you can, right? So the world need not be the way it is. There are possibilities of changing. And we constantly do it. And and the thing is, there will always be conflicts, right? The conflicts are not new, but I think the liberating thing is precisely this, that you're no longer captivated by materiality in this way. It is no longer static and predefined once and for all. You can change it. You can set about, you can cultivate better worlds which you want to be a part of, worlds that you want other people to be. And this is, I think, for me, the most important thing about it is precisely the kind of a possibility for something better, for more livable worlds, for worlds, I think living well in difference, right? How can we go about living well within these differences? I mean, there's one way that we might go about it, but the point is that, I think there's something about the fact that you can go about changes through accurate, and that's why activism is so important. But activism by doing, by actively restructuring and creating spaces, creating different types of network that directly and indirectly, right, undermine and disrupt, business as usual, right? So yeah, for me, there's this. I find that, I find it liberating for me personally.
Right.
I can see why it can be liberating. I guess my concern would be when activism turns into, I want to enforce my enacted world upon others.
Absolutely. And this is not this is the thing. I think living is an experiment, right? It's experimental, and you don't know until you try. And yes, there's that danger is always there. But I think, it does open possibilities that might not otherwise have been possible.
Yeah. My initially, my concern was more around well, I guess what we talked about in the past, sort of how do you, if the more radical portion of this around material reality not being fixed, if how do we then, adjudicate between these multiple worlds, and, talking about conspiracy theories and anti-vaxxers and that kind of thing.
I know this has always been a long concern of yours. I don't blame it. It sort of concerns me, but I think for me, sorry if I interrupted you there.
No, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
For me, I think thinking in terms of conflict, I mean, not in terms of thinking in terms of adjudication, seems to kind of bring with it this baggage of kind of, this seeing the world, the kind of, which kind of harks back to this naturalistic tendency to see the world as pre-given, right? And so there's a definite way to do things, and then you need to adjudicate, right? I think perhaps another way, a different way to go about things might be to, to explore, how differences, these types of are made, and to see whether through doing this, whether, there's any place for negotiation. So, and this has been, so one example, I mean, again, that's why in the beginning I said, it's always good to think in terms of specificity, because it's very easy to kind of, we speak about goth, we speak about capitalism, we speak about anti-vaxxers, and they kind of, especially they easily become like this monolithic nations, and sort of the specificity and the differences between that you can find within these completely get lost, right? The anti-vaxxer things is a very good example. We tend to assume they're all exactly the same, they're all irrational, but actually, they are different. Different people believe in different things. There's a great amount of specificity to the anti-vaxxer movement, right? But one example that I wanted to use was in Australia, right? So in Australia, there's Aboriginal indigenous people that have like very specific understandings about land, particularly they treat land as sacred, right, and not something that should be consumed and parceled and sort of cultivated.
Can't be possessed.
Exactly, and this is directly at odds and in conflict with what Western Australians, the way Western Australians understand land, right? So the way they've gone about this to see how can they live together through this difference, and they've gone about by bringing about different types of practices that when enable these two dramatically opposing different ways of sort of being and relating to land to sort of co-live, to sort of ways that they could live together in this difference, right? So it's always it's an experimental like practice of trying to find I mean, the way this relates to adjudication, the point of bringing this up is that there isn't, with adjudication, you always want to think, there's always like a very, like an easy way that you can, there's like a set criteria that you might be able to use that will will help you to adjudicate in every type of situation, right? So this is like that. But really, I think if you look at specific examples, you see that it's way more experimental, right? And you see that, there's a specificity to it that you cannot prescribe in advance. You need to sort of, if you have specific problems, with specific people, there's ways to try and engage and bring try to look for ways to bring these two together in the way that, I mean, again, it's difficult to say in advance exactly how to do this, right? Because there's no way of doing it. You need to kind of either instantiate the dialogue and say it might happen. It might go terribly wrong, right? And there have been a lot of cases of similar, like where it does go terribly wrong. But I think this is definitely one of the ways that you need to try and experiment. So you can call these ontological experiments, where you kind of need to kind of see if you can create practices that will enable either a dialogue or a mutual coexistence, or whatever it is that's going to facilitate the living well in difference, right? But I don't. So again, with the adjudication thing, it's always going to be on a case by case basis, and you're going to have to look at the specifics of what's going on. Sometimes there won't be any way of adjudicating. And then, of course, then you have to face, okay, fine. If you can't adjudicate, what do you do? But I think, the danger is that when you think about adjudication, you are led into, there's only one way of doing it, and it's it's either wrong or right, and and that can be helpful in certain cases, but it can also be detrimental in others, because it blocks other possibilities. It opens possibilities, forecloses others. So there's all these kind of things that needs to be sort of taken. I think again, the specificity. Look at specific cases and specific places and take it from there. And that's why, I think it's a danger of taking one idea and applying it there. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's why, I'm always wary of, using theories, one theory here to kind of explain everything. Or with identity construction, and say that identity construction is this. It's a mode of prophelicity, as Dr. Muller likes to call it. Yeah, okay, fine. Maybe in some cases. But, what that is doing is kind of creating a kind of abstract monolith that kind of completely washes away the specificity of things.
No, you're right. Like going back to the anti-vaxxer thing, I've had to, for one of my jobs, I've had to read through and listen to a lot of content from anti-vaxxers, and it's often people come to similar conclusions on varying or contradictory reasons, and also just through obviously what you were talking about, their immediate environment and their immediate interactions, and what their physical, people who maybe don't have clean drinking water, for example, and have had that experience that might influence them in some way, or all these different interactions are going to be completely variable.
I mean, exactly. I mean, it's like in the UK, for example, there's a high proportion of people of color who refuse to take the vaccine, right?
Yeah.
And there's loads of good reasons for this, eh? You see, and to label them just as anti-vaxxers, I think it's doing a great injustice, right?
It's reductive.
Yeah, exactly, precisely that. And I think, but the same thing sort of applies to even more mundane examples, right? Like everyday, quotidian, daily practices, right? And I think.
Well, I mean, you start, like, for me, I in general also, I think you start understanding things like neurodivergence differently, like even psychosis or schizophrenia or synesthesia. When you start thinking this way, something that I came across was sort of on a different note to that, but I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about magic mushrooms, and he was saying that his view was, well, they're fine, but when you have people talking about visiting other dimensions or talking to entities or meeting themselves in their past life or experiencing themselves dying and being birthed and being everything and nothing, he said it's not very valuable because it doesn't comport with our understanding of the world and objective reality, and it's just a function of our brain, which has been cobbled together through evolution and doesn't really work very well, and so it's being disrupted and communicating in a new way that tricks you into experiencing something that doesn't exist. And so when through ontological multiplicity, it opens up a whole new way of seeing these experiences that I'm still obviously clearly trying to understand. Because like on the naturalist view, if the normative sense-making infrastructure is objectively correct, what is the normative, like where these other people that are being pathologized, where in that spectrum is the gray acceptable area of sense-making? And obviously, because you might point to like measurable, reproducible data, but that's not really a solid ground once you start picking that apart.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess with normativity and the idea of mental health and, what makes something pathological is usually defined as a divergence from the norm that is so severe that it inhibits one's ability to function in society. but society was designed by people who had a certain sense of what normativity is. So there's a question is, the question is it more important to change society, or is it more important to change the people who are deemed unable to function in that society? And that's where we don't have a good way to adjudicate between, what world needs to shift in what way, or what worlds need to be, enacted in a way that makes it most comfortable for all actors in the network.
Yeah, I agree. But one thing that I was going back to to your comment on the psychedelics and what's his name's
Neil deGrasse.
Yeah, it's something that strikes me as interesting, and that is which is the fact that it sort of relates to some of this. I mean, it's again, the specificity is kind of lost in this, right?
Yeah.
Because taking psychedelics in the West, right, is a completely different thing from taking psychedelics in other sort of indigenous places where these have had a particular function, and they inhibit particular place within societies, right? So a way of communicating with the spirit. So it's completely, and the thing is, that specificity is very important, especially when it comes to psychedelic experiences, because I think that the two are completely, and it also relates to the ontological multiplicity and a way of explaining or a way of understanding sort of how shamans, for example, relate to sort of spiritual entities right through psychedelic. The way this happens in specific sort of indigenous context is completely different from the way it happens in specific Western context of just of psychedelic, the taking of psychedelics.
Right. Well, I mean, I've heard people talk about Maria Sabina in Mexico, I believe, who a lot of Americans went to in the, I don't remember, 70s or 60s to get or to have psychedelic experiences with psilocybin, and she would take them every day, right? That's part of her reality. It's a completely different a completely different world, but then we would want to impose a more correct, what we think is a more correct view. Yeah,
exactly. But they also have in these places, they have a completely different history, right? That's now been abstracted away.
Yeah.
In the different contexts, right? So it's not the same thing, and it's not an epistemic set. It's not different. That it's different ontologically, right? Because they function and they have a sort of a very distinctive history, and they are situated and they form a particular, they are part of that, certain practices in very specific ways, right? So, it's
yeah. So, okay, well, let me ask about a different subject. Maybe we'll use this to close out here. I don't know. We'll see. And that's something that comes up all the time, which is the concept of authenticity. Because it's what I normally hear from goths is the idea that you are, and not just goths, like this is common in America at least, you're bringing forth your most authentic self. You are externalizing something internal. There is some degree of self-awareness of that paradox of authenticity, because we have the phrase, we're all individuals, we just have the same boots on, which is that kind of tacit recognition that we're individuals, but also a collective. It's sort of one theory I came across that seems to align with that idea is from Max Stirner, philosopher Max Stirner, who talked about being an individualist in a collective, that there could be I think he called it a union of egoists, but that collective allowed everyone to be authentically themselves, which is kind of like paradoxical in itself. But how I wanted to ask if you had thoughts about, when it comes to identity and notions of authenticity and individualism, how you view that differently.
Yeah. I mean, again, like, sort of intuitively, I have very specific intuitive view of the word, but at the same time, and again, these are views of identity constructs, as something that is fluid, that is context specific, that there is no essence to the self, like, right? But I think at the same time, like, sort of putting my STS hat on, I'd want to say that, well, we'll have to look at specifics, because again, it's very easy to abstract even, I mean, like, the thing is, I think even when you are, so intuitively, I think that we have multiple identities. But personally, I see myself as being constituted of multiple, I am a dad, I'm a pseudo-academic, I'm a VR enthusiast, I'm a whiskey enthusiast. I have all these, these identities, right? And I suppose, which sort of intuitively suggests to me that there isn't one core identity, which is me. And I've always been very comfortable about this. Has never been, actually, this is it's a funny, identity construction has always been a funny topic for me personally, speaking personally, because identity has never been an issue for me, in the sense of I can never remember ever thinking about my own identity, right? How is it that I fit in a particular way? This has never really been a thing for me, and I thought about it, and I wondered why this is the case. And I guess I'm sorry, I'm going a bit autobiographical here. Is that I've moved around a lot, and and I also have I've told you, Danny, that I'm legally blind. Well, I can see, I'm legally blind. And I think this is kind of, these are the two reasons I think that I've kind of always sort of put the notion of identity in, for me personally, I can see why the opposite could happen for other people. But for me, what has happened, it has sort of made any sort of notions of identity go into the background, because I think I've always had to adjust and be malleable in very different contexts. So for me, I've always had to be very like the thing of sight. There's always a particular way that I need to be, right? And I need to practice in particular ways. And so maybe this is the reason why, it's maybe just comes, that I naturally understand the notion of identity, something which is very fluid and contingent. Yeah. But at the same time, as I was saying, from, thinking about identity, and, with this sort of through from an SDS register, I'd want to say that, well, I think that we should, this is an empirical issue, right? An empirical, not in the sort of a strict naturalistic scientific sense, but in the sense that you need to go and see, how specific people at specific times go about doing identity. I mean, it's no coincidence that the notion of identity has become a particular issue in the current era, right? And that the issue sort of comes in and out of fashion and becomes an issue. So the issue of identity is an historical one. People haven't always worried about identity. It comes up at certain times at certain places. So I think that's something interesting in itself. Why is it that the identity is an issue? And then given that identity is an issue, can we sort of empirically study how it is that people are? And I think that if we do this, I think that you're going to find all sorts of, ways, some that were going to confirm this idea that identity is multiple. You see this, but then you'll see how certain people are very still fixed on being a specific way. Like, for example, I think about my dad, right, who's never thought about, I doubt that he's ever also considered about, how he fits into, considered or entertained notions about identity. But he's always portrayed himself as someone who, always wanted to just provide for his family. He's always wanted to, right? So this is, in a way, this is how he's exhibited his identity. And that's when I think that this is an authentic way of being, right? What I'm saying is that I think there's going to be different, there isn't just, I don't want my sort of kind of intuitive understanding of,
Right.
I don't want this to be a model for all how,
Right.
I think that would be a mistake. I think, and obviously it will directly contradict this idea of multiple worlds or multiple ontologies, right? And I think if we apply that to, let me ask you, what is your opinion? Both of you, what are your opinions?
Sure.
I actually kind of feel very similarly to how Paulo was expressing a relationship with identity, because I haven't really felt a strong personal need to cultivate, to enact a specific identity. I view, that sort of idea that there's a multiplicity of identities inherent in each person as just sort of a given and a norm. So, where I identify with the goth subculture and all that, and I consider myself a goth, I also, will consider myself, an eternal student. I consider myself an IT professional. I consider myself a friend to some people. I consider myself a son from my family side of things, stuff like that. Though even with the son thing, I consider myself gender fluid, so I don't necessarily associate strongly with any particular gender, but I don't necessarily have a problem with being gendered either, because again, I don't hold on to any of those identities strong enough for it to be something that I feel a need to do any particular enactment because I need to represent myself. It's one of the other reasons I have such an issue with Dr. Muller's concept of profilicity. It's not that I have an issue with it. It's just that I don't feel it, because I don't care to cultivate a profile.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't actively do that. When I post things because I like them, not to try to evince a reaction in other people or to make them view me in a certain way. But I can't say I'm completely and entirely, divorced from the concept that other people see my actions and what I do and what I post and how I interact and will put an identity on me. I'm okay with that. I expect that. At the same time, I kind of like to play with that. So there is an aspect of me that's a little bit, has that imp of the perverse, where I like to repeat a behavior long enough for people to assume I'm some sort of way. And then I do something that doesn't fit that, just kind of mess with people, because I like the idea of sort of identity fluidity. And I like the idea that, it's dangerous to put people too rigidly in a box, and it's good to see people more as a whole complex web of shifting identities based on circumstance and environment and just, growing up and aging and changing, as you evolve as a human, because I consider, change to be an inherent part of life and living. At the same time, though, when it comes to concept of identity and, back to the identity of goth, things like that, and back to kind of what we were discussing around enacting the identity and creating these multiple worlds in relation to identity is, one thing I always think about is, when I look at other people and think about other people's identity, I kind of do what everybody does. I kind of view behaviors and attitudes and what they do and how they interact with the world and who they associate with and all that as sort of part of what I can see, as an outsider, of their identity. And I don't view that as something, or I try to avoid. I can't say 100% because, subconscious bias and all those fun things that come when it comes to how we analyze and project onto other people based on our own experiences. But beyond that, I try to hold that very lightly. And so I'm kind of viewing other people as a series of, what did they do? What did they say? What are they interested in? What are those sorts of things? But I also try to kind of delve into why. I'm a big proponent of the question of why for a lot of things. And I mostly direct that towards myself. So when I think of identity for myself, I like to ask myself, why? When I'm interested in a certain thing, or I decide to go to an event, or I decide I like this person versus I don't like this other person, I always try to ask myself why and try to really dig into what's going on. And if I keep asking why, it seems to come to almost a point of singularity that I can't really get past. I don't know what that is. That's kind of my conception of what I guess a true fixed identity is the end of the whys. And there's a possibility it's turtles all the way down. I'm not really sure, but that's kind of how I conceive of that concept of a core identity. It's that whatever that string of whys takes you to, that leads forward to, I chose to enact this particular world in this particular circumstance, or I chose to project this particular facet of my identity in this particular environment. And I mean, I'm not attached to the idea that underlying core identity necessarily exists, but I'm also, like when we talk about the Big Bang, I can't see past it. Like everything sort of converges to this thing, and I can't define it, but it seems to be a point of convergence. And that's kind of how I look at identity, is that sort of point of convergence that I'm continually negotiating in my own psyche for myself.
That makes a lot of sense. Just knowing you personally, I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, good. I like to think I'm consistent. That would be what? Authenticity, right?
I guess for me, actually something I really like that was brought up referenced in your thesis from Varela, which is the Buddhist notion of groundlessness.
Right.
I really love that. The basically the idea that identity is an amalgam, there is no self, and that that's extrapolated to the world is groundless. But as speaking to identity, this idea that the self is a collection of ever-changing dynamic relations. I really resonated with that. And for me, that creates an easing of identity, because like what you were talking about, Paulo, you're not more of your true self with your parents or your friends or by yourself. There's no objective self. There's just this, there's a co-creation, an emerging co-creation, I guess. And that's been helpful for me to start learning to detach my emotions from my circumstances. I guess similar to another Buddhist parable of like the two arrows. You might get hit with the first arrow, but the second arrow is how we react to the first arrow. So it's self-inflicted, so we can avoid it. So for example, maybe I can't get tickets to see The Cure, but I can avoid additional emotional distress through a recognition that my perspective and actions in the world contribute to the construction of the self. So I can shift things rather than getting stuck in a loop. And I can I've been practicing mindfulness a lot through meditation to kind of calm my anxiety. And that's freed me to be more flexible and experience less pain and anxiety and guilt and shame. And I've even, well, speaking of meditation, I've even kind of experienced that physically or whatever, mentally, through meditation. Not really ego death, but just like a sensation that the mask of identity falls away, and having a feeling of like spaciousness and decenteredness, kind of that, like the cliche, what I was talking about before with mushrooms, but the like feeling a oneness with everything, in the sense that I'm constituted by and constitute everything around me. That's not something that happens all the time, but every once in a while I get like little tastes of that kind of thing. And I think that thinking about identity that way, the reason I like that so much is, well, one of the reasons I like it so much, I actually pulled a quote from, because I was looking into groundlessness, and I found this quote by, what was the book? I wrote it, The Way of Tenderness. I don't know who the author was. I didn't write it down, but the quote was, if the fluidity of identity were readily reorganized, it would certainly be more difficult to disenfranchise some or to privilege other groups of people. It would be much more difficult to monopolize resources in a society where identity is recognized as fluid, unquote. And I think what they're getting at is that you wouldn't see a CEO as a CEO or a drug addict as a drug addict, because identity isn't this grounded thing where people are stuck entities, so we treat them like that. You start to see people as ever-changing and contingent on their material circumstances. And so even like weirdly in the, like, this is the last month or two that I've been thinking about this, but really embracing and focusing on that, the groundlessness, has provided me with, because I was like, let's see how far I can push it. It provided me with tools to, in some cases, better endure physical pain, like with chronic migraines that I get, for one example, because the pain doesn't go away, but I can shift my perspective to observe it or be more curious about it, and not make it like, not attach a sense of self to the pain, which is really hard to do. And like, that's a practice that I'm trying to continually do every day, especially like with anxiety, but that's been a big deal for me. So I think when I see myself as being situated in time and space and constituted by material practices and not bound to a specific self, that like that self could be seen as harmful or inevitable, has been empowering in the way that I can kind of make these slight shifts in focus or environment or attention to change the self that I am in that moment. And it helps, like, helps me change and break through some behaviors that I feel like I'm stuck in. Like the example I was thinking of was, I know I get really distracted by my phone, and like that pulls me out of important moments in my life. And if I can remember and remind myself that I can break the link between that pull as like this imperative urge through, thinking about these things, is again it's really powerful for me, right? So it's like that the cliche of "you're not your thoughts" kind of thing, but it's more meaningful in an ontological context, because I've realized that like my perception isn't a computational process or like something that just happens in my head, and so there's more fluidity to that, and that's helped me to be that I can focus more, like I can shift it and I can focus more on behaviors that I think are beneficial, like being kinder to myself or being more compassionate and that kind of thing. like, if that makes sense. I know it's kind of cheesy when I put it that way.
That
but,
makes perfect sense, actually. But I have two questions, if I may.
Yeah.
One, have you ever thought about giving up your phone? And two, how would you say this conception of identity relates to prophelicity? Because I know you're quite keen on that. I was just wondering, you know way more about it than I do. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on it, if you do have any.
Well, I mean, I have thought about giving up my phone, but I mean, I use it a lot less. I have to use it for work, but I've been doing things like leaving it in other rooms. It's very difficult, and part goes back to like the practice of bringing myself back to thinking about these things. I have to think through them. I don't just necessarily do them because I've been doing them for so long in a certain way that I kind of tend to default to that way. But I've always struggled to change that behavior, and so thinking about it in a different way has made it easier to change that behavior. Yeah, I mean, I guess just to make it short, I was initially really attracted to prophelicity because it made sense to me, just sort of from the perspective that I was viewing myself and those around me as, just to use the one example of like the second order observation of, instead of thinking about myself through my first person experience, I was thinking about how others were perceiving me and perceiving myself that way. And so thinking that a lot of other people were doing that. And what I liked about that idea was that embedded in that is the, I guess, intuition that the self is constructed. It seemed to make sense as sort of a experience a lot of people had because social media is so prolific. But especially in the last month or so, reading through your thesis and thinking about these things again, it's become more obvious that, you've mentioned a few reasons already, but that like, obviously not everyone utilizes social media in the same way, thinks about these things in the same ways, in the same material circumstances. I think a lot of that was also piggybacking on Butler's sort of performativity all the way down, which was more devoid of material interactions and less emphasized historical context and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I liked it for those reasons, but it's, again, with like, I still have these inclinations towards latching on to theories that explain everything for everyone, just because it's easy and it's comforting.
Very comforting.
And I have to always pull myself back from it. Yeah.
Exactly. I think it's, it's one of those things like the phone, right? It's something you need to learn. You see, you need to unlearn things. I mean, like, I have a background in I have a BA in philosophy. And this is deeply ingrained in me, and it's something that I've actively have had to unlearn, and it's not been easy. And I think, and I still occasionally still find I have to kind of just, I need to, when I find myself to catch myself doing, I need to kind of just stop, take a step back and kind of, remind myself of what I'm doing. And the thing is, and again, like I said in the beginning, I think personally for me, it's all about the specificity. There's nothing wrong with doing philosophy, with creating grand theories of, like identity in this case. But it's important to realize that, like I said, there's a specificity to that. There's a context in which this is being done. There's a reason for which this is being done, right? That, it's a specific thing. And once you start realizing, well, hang on a second, there's a great discrepancy here between, sort of other material concrete practice and this particular concrete practice, right? Mm-hmm. And the tendency is always, we always want to match this one grand thing with everything that's going on. Well, where it's difficult to kind of appreciate the fact that, when I'm writing my thesis, when I'm communicating with you, when I'm doing theory, I'm doing something very specific that implicates me and that particular thing that I'm doing in very specific context, very specific material, social, historical, networks.
Right.
I think it can be helpful, a bit like the identity thing. It can be helpful once you start realizing this, because it's helpful as it is scary, right? In the same sense that it can be, it's comforting to latch on to, Grantham, but it's also, it's the same things also going on here as well, because then you can say, hang on a second, things are way messier, and he's going to get, you can never get a full understanding of things, and especially if coming from a Western education system, that is so ingrained in us that it's really difficult to kind of, and really, you can create all sorts of dissonances, like drastic dissonances. So, very easy.
So I think, I had other, I think we'll probably, I think we've done a pretty good job
go on
of,
for many hours, and if we don't stop at some point, we will not.
Yeah, I had specific questions about agential cuts and autopoiesis and stuff like that, but I think we've done a good job, so it's probably a good enough place to wrap everything up.
Well, I just want to thank both of you, first of all, for inviting me, and second of all, for this amazing conversations. I hope it hasn't been one-sided. It's one of those things that I like to think with other people. And Danny, I need to say that, I feel intimately entangled with you because, my that sounds really weird, I know, but
no, I like
know what I mean.
Yeah.
I thought you might. And the thing is that, my thought has sort of developed in conjunction with you. We've had these, and I think that there's a tendency, I get the impression that you think you've learned a lot from me and I've learned nothing from you, and I need to tell you this is not the case. I've learned loads from you, and this discussion is itself being a learning process. And through the show, both you and Trey, I've developed certain sensitivities that I definitely don't think I would have latched onto had I not had this engagement with both of you. So I'd like to thank both of you for this.
Wow. Well, thank you. One of the sweetest things anyone has ever said to me. I really appreciate that. That's really
I really mean it.
Yeah, that's great. It's one of the reasons that I've found so much fulfillment in the fact that, Danny invited me to be on this show as a co-host, is that it is a great opportunity to learn, to interact with so many different people and learn different perspectives and different ideas, and just to engage with all of that sort of multiplicity of experience that exists in this world, at least, as filtered through the filter of our audience and the subcultural topics we talk about. But still, it's always fascinating to me to engage in these conversations and to have these experiences.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that you both do such a great job. I'm, forever impressed with not only the way you handle things, but your general sort of ability to connect things and make connection and open possibilities where others will simply foreclose. I mean, I find this it's amazing, really, honestly, and I just hope that you guys can do this for as as long as you possibly can, because I think other people probably gained just as much as variously, as much as I do. So thank you.
I mean, I will say, since we're going there, you two, I'm so happy to have had this conversation and this time, because both of you are the two people in my life who I have learned the most from and have impacted me in so many ways over time, and caused so many changes in my life, more than anyone I think I've had a relationship with. And so I'm grateful for that relationship, and also was really, this was a lot of fun, and it was really wonderful to have both of you like in the same room, so to speak, because both of you have a lot of somebody's calling me, hold a lot of meaning.
Avoid the phone.
It's the pharmacy, it's not important.
Get rid of the phone. I got rid of the phone 10 years ago. It's the best thing I've ever done.
Yeah, I don't know if I will ever get there, but reduction at least is the goal.
You will. You can't believe in you.
Changing the relationship is the most important thing.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Album review.
So this month we are reviewing the album Last Stop to Nowhere from the band Reflection Black, and I'll read just a little snippet of their bio on Bandcamp, which says, Reflection Black is the manifestation of Mastermind's Ellis Alex musical visions, originating from the urban landscapes of Athens, Greece. Band aims at delivering melodic goth rock and post-punk with a modern 21st century edge and the darkest imagery infused by Alex's black metal past. The result is dark, fast, and polished, striking the perfect balance between dreamy synth lines, crystalline guitars, and infectious vocal hooks. The album title summarizes the essence of the lyrical themes explored throughout the entire record. Quote, a sense of mental and spiritual escapism with the questioning of current realities of all forms, unquote. Alex explains, quote, by exploring the concepts of sleep, death, dreams, and the occult in the album's lyrics, spiritual elevation and degradation can be seen as two sides of the same coin, leading to a state of non-existence, the last stop to nowhere, unquote. Awfully apropos for this episode.
Yeah.
So I thought we could play the track Under Your Shine.
No, that was definitely one of the ones that I did like. I listened to all of them, and I did like that one, and I liked track 5 fairly well as well. Call by name. Those are the two that sort of stuck out to me. So.
So my first exclamation out loud on this, listening to this album, was Sax Goth, which is by far the most important thing on this album.
That's fair.
It's only the first track though, but it was a lovely surprise. I never expect saxophone, but when it happens, it's always absolute magic. It was a great way to start the album because, at least for me, because I had some preconceptions going into the album based off of the cover, which is this gorgeous, like, cosmic, ethereal image of a person like transcending into the astral plane or something. I don't know. It looks great, but it made me think of like it was going to be a Drab Majesty clone or a Kalen Mikla clone or something like that. But it's not. You do get sort of spacey, ethereal sounds, but it's always mixed with other elements. So like track 3, Under Your Shine, which we just listened to, kind of to me felt like it could be a Cure song if they were really into dark wave. But it also has this sparkly sci-fi sound to it that I really love. Last Stop to Nowhere, which was the next song, is more of a laid back track, but does some interesting things like there's like a spoken word lyrical section, and there's this really cool guitar solo that sounds like it's ripped out of a sick 80s track. Let the Spirit, which was track 6, opens with what to me sounds like a Sisters of Mercy guitar riff, and then swerves into this blend of like modern post-punk melodies and 80s synths, which was a nice blend. I think a lot of this album tries to mesh retro sounds with modern sensibilities. That track specifically has this fantastic chorus that has this like transcendent moment through the melody. At least for me, the way I experience music, that makes me feel like I'm being pulled out of my body because it's so these soaring melodies. The lyrics to that song are actually literally "Let Your Spirit Fly," but a few other tracks have that sort of soaring chorus on them, which I'm a sucker for. I always like beautiful, catchy, melodic choruses and songs. Yet Unseen Colors is another example of that. That was actually one I wish was longer because it's this beautiful synth ballad, and I feel like the chorus should have been like repeated more often, or the song could have gone on longer because it has this romantic, dreamy quality to it that really pulled me in, and I didn't want it to let me go. A lot of the synth work I actually found very interesting because it's not similar to what I usually hear with, again, like Drab Majesty or Winter Severity Index. I think maybe the closest I could think of was like a Frozen Autumn. You get less of the swirling reverbed sounds with more of for more of a higher pitched, fragile sounding tone, and then there's some like quirky odd sounds and noises that I kind of associate specifically with the 80s that are just very like, they're either sparkly and light or kind of bombastic and bouncy. There's some synth lines in No Stars in the Sky that to me sound like they could have been in an old Castlevania game or something. And the drum machine as well, I assume it's a drum machine, but it also to me sounds like it has a very 80s influence in the snare and the tom sounds, and then the actual rhythm of the drum machine is more of what I associate with more of a modern beat, which is a nice contrast. So the album, I think, ends up with this sound that is going to make it stand out a bit from other post-punk and dark wave bands right now. But the formula isn't changed so much that it's unfamiliar. I like that you get bits and pieces that feel familiar, but then transition into the band's own distinctive sound. The only thing I haven't talked about are the vocals, and I'm kind of at a loss for how to feel about them. I feel like it's fairly unique. there's a lot of reverb, but under the reverb, he kind of sounds like he's drunk in a strange way. Like there's this kind of slur rather than like a crisp delivery. For some reason, again, weirdly, it reminds me of emo bands in the early 2000s, but without the high pitch and the whine that comes with it. I don't know. It's very, I don't know how to parse or how to relate the vocals, at least from my experience. But I don't think they're bad. I don't think they're good. It's like, not to say that they're not good, but like they're fine. That was maybe for me the only part that I wasn't super excited about. So I would say it's a solid album. I think it's something fun and different to listen to. It's definitely worth checking out. I would give it a 3.5.
Nice. All right. So my attitude towards the album did shift partly due to changes in listening medium, which was really an interesting experience to me. So as I usually do when I'm listening to one of these albums for the music reviews, I'll put it on in my car. Because I have between a 20 and 50-minute commute to and from work, depending on traffic. So it's a decent time to throw on an album, and then I'm driving my car, so I'm able to focus specifically on
here in my
something. Car. Exactly. I'd feel safest of all.
Yes.
But it just allows me I can really focus on something. Whereas, when I'm listening to music at home, I'm sitting at my computer and I'm, browsing the web, or I'm playing a video game in the background. I'm doing something else. I'm rarely at home do I find myself sitting and just focusing on music. The exception would be sometimes when I go to bed, because usually when I go to bed, I'll just typically it's my Spotify playlist, but I'll throw some music on my phone and just put it on a timer to shut itself off in a half hour. But at that point, I'm also not trying to focus on the music. I'm playing music to wind down to go to sleep. So in theory, I go to sleep in the middle of whatever I'm listening to. And that doesn't really help me analyze. So I started listening to this in my car, and I found the album to be really, really muddy. Like everything was kind of all on top of each other. It was hard to kind of distinguish a lot of the instruments, the sort of bass blended with the guitar, blended with the vocals. There was the wash of reverb. So I was kind of disenchanted with it initially in that environment. It was just like, I kind of like what's happening here, and I kind of get little bits of something jumping out that's enjoyable, whether it was a synth line or things cut out and they were letting the guitar solo do a thing. Or the vocals came to the fore, but for the most part, a lot of the tracks seemed to sort of blend together in sort of a massive sound that just felt like it was kind of poorly mixed. And that was my very first impression. I did find it most egregious on the first two tracks from when I was initially listening to it, and I was having trouble sort of distinguishing between the two. They just kind of went together and blended into each other. And it was one of the reasons I gravitated towards the tracks I particularly like, which were track 3, the one we listened to, and then track 5 was the other one, was because those seemed to kind of break away from that a little bit more and had a little bit more clarity with the individual, instruments, their melodic lines, their harmonic content and whatnot, where I felt like there was something I could grab onto rather than just sort of a, on first impression, kind of a generic goth rock that was mixed in a poor to mediocre manner.
Yeah.
But then when I came home and decided to try, changing up a little bit to see if I can get a different perspective, I put on some headphones, and I've got some decent pseudo studio headphones that are, a little bit more precise, and it's a much cleaner listening environment. And the experience completely changed at that point. Things did seem much more clear. It did seem things were more balanced. I was able to pick up more instruments. And to a degree, that's the design of studio headphones. And part of me makes me think that this whole album was perhaps mixed and mastered exclusively on studio headphones or exclusively within a studio environment with no testing on other sound systems to see how it would come off on, different systems. Because it was one of those things that you kind of need, or as I felt, I kind of needed a very pristine and accurate sound system to really come to grips with the album, because it was fairly densely layered. So that was kind of my shifting experience, and I thought that was interesting. It was one of the first times I've had an experience like that where I noted such a stark difference between listening to something on headphones and on a different system. I guess the only exception to that was when I was DJing and stuff, and I was sort of doing my own little remixes of things. I had a similar experience where when I mix something on my headphones and it sounds good, and then I play it on a different system and it sounds terrible. Not that this one sounded terrible, but mine was a more extreme example. Someone requested I do a sort of a gothish industrial remix of the Pirates of the Caribbean song, the one from the Disney ride, the Pirate's Life for Me, Yo Ho, Yo Ho, which I did, and I put it together, and I don't even think I still have a copy of it, but I put something together that I played on my headphones, and it sounded okay, and then I brought it into the club that I was DJing at and played it there, and it was this boomy, bassy mass of nothing. Oh. It was the person who requested it recognized it and appreciated that I did this thing for them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they seemed to enjoy it, and in that it was good, but it was one of those things where, yeah, I was playing it and mixing it and balancing it to my headphones, which at that point weren't necessarily, I mean, I have much better headphones now than I did back, what was that, probably 20 years ago. So, the bass levels weren't necessarily good. So I was amping up the bass to make, me feel like it was a club ready track. And then you play it on big bass heavy club speakers, and the overemphasis on the bass just drowned everything out.
Right.
So that was kind of my first experience. And I feel that not to that same degree, but this album kind of falls into that same trap where it might've been mixed in a more pristine environment without giving a lot of thought towards how it would sound in different, less pristine environments. So I thought that was an interesting thing to experience.
That makes me think I should listen to our podcast in the car at some point, because I don't think I've ever done that.
It's probably not a bad idea, though. It's probably less of a pressing issue when you're dealing with just speech, because you don't have quite the range of sounds that you're trying to layer and make all sort of cohere together. Because usually what the issue with it in the car was, I was finding this very muddy mid-range, because the guitars, the synths, and the vocals are all fighting in this mid-range space. And then, of course, the drums and the bass are down on the low end, but there wasn't a lot of other low-end stuff. That seemed to be its own thing. But it was that just those three primary elements just sort of fighting for that mid-range space made it so it was very hard, particularly for me to hear and understand lyrics. So that's kind of what I felt. It was too busy in the mid-range was what my initial experience of it was. So kind of started with not really a negative impression. I've definitely had more negative reactions to albums we've reviewed in the past. I didn't find it that offensive. I just was sort of disappointed because it felt like it was poorly recorded. Was my initial critique, was that this is, a little bit more lo-fi, a little poorly recorded. But, I'm listening on better headphones. It's not that it's necessarily poorly recorded, but it hasn't been mixed for as wide a distribution as it probably should be, given what it's probably going to be played on for the vast majority of people listening to it. So that was kind of my first impression. Overall, listening to it, though, I felt it was very much situated in the goth rock genre, especially with the guitar and drum programming. Because I agree with you. I think it is a drum machine. Felt very goth rock to me. Vocals to some degree as well. The synth work was a little bit different, and I found that interesting. And actually, what the synth work reminded me, especially on track 5. That's one that it really hit me. And some of the other ones, but it reminded me a lot of Kevin Key's synth work. Less so with Skinny Puppy itself, but more with like Download and some of the other side projects, where it wasn't so much. I mean, when you think of Skinny Puppy, the sampling of media really sort of takes the fore, rather than the synth atmospherics. But Kevin definitely has a specific voice when it comes to how he crafts sounds timbrally in his synth work. And track 5 really just shouted Skinny Puppy to me, or at least Kevin Key's synth work there, because it was the synth line. It's not the rest of the music around it. None of it really sounds very Skinny Puppy-esque. But that synth work really reminded me of that, which I think dovetails a little bit, Danny, with your impression about the 80s sound of it. Because it is sort of that earlier 80s synth styles. And I found it was a mix of interesting sounds. It wasn't your traditional preset based stuff that you get with like new wave, some of the new wave stuff where, the bands found these exciting new instruments in these synths and, poked around at the keyboards until they found one that they could play a fun riff on. And that's why, a lot of people sort of view the 80s sounds as sort of cheesy, because they are a lot of preset based stuff, because the programming of synths was a new thing and a lot of people didn't have the expertise or time to master that. But when you do get to some of the bands who were more experimental, who were digging more deeply into it, you do get some more interesting tonalities, and you get things like your Skinny Puppies, your Depeche Modes, that are more focused on the synth work and making unique sounds. And I think this band did a pretty good job of capturing that. The only exception was on the first track, which I found the synth arpeggio to be mind-numbing and maddening, but not because the synth work as far as the timbral quality of the sound wasn't all that interesting, but the thing that really bothered me about it the most was it was basically a simple arpeggio that didn't stop. It just kept going for the whole they would change it, they would mix it up, it would be like a basic octave, then the top note would go up and down, and it had sort of a melodic arc to it. But it sort of got old and became almost like a drill in my head after a couple of listens. So that track definitely I didn't like because of that. It was just because of this very sort of, to me, simplistic and kind of boring use of an arpeggiator for the synth line. The second track pulled back from that. It still we used an arpeggiator, but it wasn't as in the forefront, because the first track that synth was very much at the forefront and was a very piercing sort of high pitch. It was pretty much the only element in the upper registers. So it was very present. And with my already mentioned sort of muddiness in the mid range, this synth line that I found sort of repetitive and annoying was much more brought to the fore. But that was just in that first track, and that was really my only complaint about the first track. Other than that, I didn't really gravitate towards it, but I did find that part of it annoying. The second track does also use an arpeggiator, and it's also not all that interesting, but they have a more subtle sound, and they push it back into the mix a little bit more. So I didn't mind it as much, but I did kind of feel the first two tracks kind of blended in together for me. But then the third track, which is the first one that kind of, said, oh, this is interesting. It's something about it grabbed my attention. And, I didn't sit down. I didn't have the time to sit down and kind of write down my thoughts on each song. So I don't have a good idea of why it grabbed my attention. It just did. So I did like the third track. The fourth track didn't grab me as much, but didn't bother me for any reason. And then the fifth track had the Skinny Puppy thing, or the Kevin Key synth hallmark that really stuck out to me. And then the rest of it, I did like a lot of the other albums. I do think the Let the Spirit that you had mentioned was also a very nice sound. I liked their synth work on that. I found that as the album went on, it got more interesting. Just the sonic palette that was being used throughout got more interesting.
But no saxophones.
No saxophones. That doesn't affect me as much as it does you. I know you're really, like you already mentioned, you're a huge sax goth.
Yeah.
I like it because it's something novel and interesting. I like it for the change in pace and variety. though it isn't something that I necessarily am like, oh, sax goth, I really jump out of my seat about it. But I do like it, and I like the novelty of it, and I do find it interesting. I did kind of forget. I remember the first time I listened through the album, I immediately heard the sax and thought of you. But after that, I mean, it was only in that first track, and it had its other issues that distracted me from it. So I completely forgot that it was there. In fact, when you mentioned it, like had this vague memory of, oh yeah, I did think of something, and I kind of turned it on real quiet in the background and was listening to it to find that sax part. Like, oh yeah, you're right, there it is. I remember that now. So yeah, it was good. Yeah, overall, a good album. My experience, actually, I ironically enough kind of liked the vocals, and usually that's one of the things I complain about the most in a lot of goth bands. But one of the things I liked about it was maybe part of what you didn't like about it, because there was a little bit of this sort of slipperiness to the vocals. It wasn't.
Yeah, that's a good word.
It wasn't crisp. With the melodic lines weren't hugely well defined. They were kind of slippery. I think calling it drunk is maybe overstating it, but I mean, I can kind of see where where you get it, where you could think of that. The thing I liked about it is, I mean, the bulk of it, especially the verse lyrics, were very much verging on that sort of standard goth rock male baritone voice, but it did have a little bit more expressiveness to it. So not quite as sort of dead as like the Andrew Eldritch template of the deep baritone voice that is very sort of droning, but also not as quite as wild and expressive as your Robert Smith or Peter Murphy and some of his more unhinged points, but somewhere between those two, where we would have this sort of the verses would be a nice, pleasant melody in this very comfortable baritone timbre, but still having a vocal line. It wasn't monotone. It wasn't too disassociated from the emotion. There was definitely some emotion there. But then, as you mentioned, the soaring choruses in some of the songs would definitely, that emotional level of the expressiveness would amp up. And you'd get some very strong and powerful singing with some really interesting melodies and very prominent melodies, which is nice. I like a good, melodic instrumental passage as well. They didn't do that as much with the bass line. That's one thing that I kind of miss, is the bass was a little bit more buried than your traditional goth post-punk. It wasn't quite as foregrounded as the sort of stereotypical, this is what makes post-punk, or by extension, goth rock. The bass was definitely, for the most part, it was in service of the drums. It was a rhythmic element, foregrounding the harmony and then providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the drums. And that's fine. I don't dislike that. I'm a big bass, guitar and just bass instrument, whether it's bass synth or bass guitar. I'm a huge fan of it. So I do like to have more of that foregrounding, but it didn't feel too much like it was missing in this. I would have liked it to be a little bit more prominent, but it still felt like a pretty solid goth rock sound to the album on the whole. So overall, I think I'm kind of going to have to straight up agree, for different reasons, but agree with you on that rating, Danny, with a 3.5. It's a good, solid album. I definitely recommend going into it, but I mean, it wasn't mind blowing, but it was good. It was quality, and I enjoyed my time with it.
I agree.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
So to kick off Sinister Suggestions, I thought I would start with a book recommendation, actually. I realized I don't really talk about the books I'm reading unless we're doing a full episode on them. And if you're like me and you don't have a lot of time and or you're in the middle of multiple different books, then I think this is a good suggestion because it's a very easy read. You can knock out a bunch of pages in like 30 minutes and get through it pretty quickly. So the book is called From God to Goth, a 9 Pills sequel. And it's about Johnny Halfhead and his experience as a young goth, sort of from his childhood to getting into the goth band 13 Candles in the 90s. Interestingly, even though this book is about his experience in England in the 80s, it's eminently relatable because he describes growing up in a closed Christian family. I would infer, or if I remember correctly, I think it was Mormonism. I don't know if he actually says. But this very conservative, isolated environment, and transitioning from that into the broader world and trying to create a new self for him. And, you know, he talks about a lot of the shame and guilt and emotions around things like sexual emotions, but all kinds of different experiences. And that those stories of trying to learn new social skills and grow into this community of people after having been so inculcated into this harmful rhetoric and this highly conservative environment is relatable to my experiences, even though this is a completely different time period. And, you know, there's stories of sort of youthful malfeasance and kismets and love gained and lost, and, you know, these sort of things that a lot of us experienced as teenagers that is really enjoyable to read, especially when a lot of the goth literature out there is fairly dry sort of histories or analyses, with a few notable exceptions. This, I think, fits nicely into that arena to give you a break from that kind of stuff, because honestly, some of these books feel like a slog to get through rather than enjoyable. So that's my quick book recommendation. And with that, I guess we'll get into the music. So there are not as many recommendations this time around as normal, and that's because a lot of the recommendations are full-length albums. And so that just takes more time to sit through and listen to and think through. But let's get into it. So the first band we have is Lovely Eddie and their new album Destructive. They have crept out of the shadows of California with a straight down the line spooky post-punk album. In fact, I'm pretty sure they used some 1950s ghost sound effects on one of the tracks, which I love. This 5-track album features haunting, dark vocals that sound like they're sung in a literal Batcave, a stripped-down drum machine, jangly guitar, and rhythmic bass. The EP is in the vein of bands like She Passed Away, but without the heavy electronic darkwave influence. So if you enjoy that style but a bit darker, then this EP is for you. It's short, to the point, and dancey as hell. From Alaska's only goth duo Cliff and Ivy come the new single Die Tonight. I always love their blend of late 70s punk rock. It sounds kind of like similar to bands like Sex Gang Children. Ivy always kills the vocal delivery, this time with a deeper alto vocal that reminds me of bands like Malaria, whom I love. Musically, it's goth with a punk rock punch, with some guitar melodies that would be at home in a Gene Loves Jezebel song or a Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry song. The drum machine has a really powerful kick drum, and there's a great weird little bass solo 3/4 of the way through. Killer track as always. Don't sleep on Cliff and Ivy. If we now move the darkwave slider all the way away from post-punk to the other side of the spectrum, we get Ruby Lustre out of Oregon with their new EP Hex Box. The vocals immediately stood out to me and are almost reminiscent of the late 90s with bands like Genitorturers or Rasputina or Kidney Thieves might be the closest analogy. I know those are all very different bands, but you get this almost raspy ghost vocal that sits a bit back in the mix to evoke this sense of enigma. And personally, it gives me that vibe of 90s independent cyberpunk films. This whole EP has a very specific vibe that creates this sense that I should be in a dive bar with like Dark City playing on cathode ray tube TVs and corrugated plastic tubes with steam coming out of them hanging from the ceiling. But there's also a very modern sensibility to it as well. So the title track, killer EP, definitely check it out. In the run-up to their new album Lost Sins, A Cloud of Raves out of New York have released 4 new singles over the last little while. Parable is more synth-focused with this really fun, bouncy, up-and-down bass line that makes me want to jump around my living room. Requiem for the Sun has this reverbed arena rock drum machine a la The Mission and a vocal melody that brings to mind bands like The Awakening. It's big, bombastic, and bold. The other singles continue from there with that kind of 90s gothic rock feel, and this is one of those bands, one of the few bands that are filling that niche, so definitely check them out. I'm looking forward to the full album. I didn't realize Azzy was also speaking with them, so I can't wait to hear what they say on All Goth Considered in a minute, because I haven't actually listened to it yet. Next up from Spain is Malefixio, one of the few death rock bands in the sea of post-punk. The new album features Spanish lyrics and femme vocals that modulate between biting, harsh punk angst and creeping, haunting, sinister melodic singing, and even banshee-like wailing. Musically, you get more of the dark punk side of death rock. Slower paced, evil sounding guitars, sharp, tinny drum machine. Some tracks make great use of deep rhythmic drumming, which I love. It's a dark, sometimes ominous sounding album that is heavy on atmosphere, and I'm convinced was recorded in a cemetery. The album actually scared the shit out of me at one point because I was wearing headphones, and the way they mixed the music, it sounded like someone was talking behind me, so 10 out of 10 for making me poop myself. If we crank up the speed of our dark punk and throw in some post-punk influences, then you've got the new album from Adrenochrome. Two of the things I love about dark punk and death rock, the people that listen to that kind of music are often incredibly music savvy and wear that influence on their sleeve. In this case, Adrenochrome is likely a reference to the Sisters of Mercy song, and really death rockers are some of the most knowledgeable music aficionados I've met. The second thing I love is the explicit political activism. I think being socially conscious has become more common with goth music these days, but you're going to want to jump into death rock if you are really looking for it. For example, the label they're on states that every donation from music downloads will be sent to anarchist collective projects or go to people in need, which always gives me renewed hope for the goth scene. Anyway, the album is fantastic. You get a vocal delivery that reminds me of Hagar in the Womb and Rubella Ballet, and there's likely some musical influence there as well, but I definitely hear more influence from like early Skeletal Family or Scarlet's Remains or Catholic Spit, that kind of thing. You get lots of hi-hat and cymbals on the drums, which give it an early 80s, late 70s feel. The guitars are unrelenting and the bass sounds evil as hell. The album goes so fucking hard and I love it. It will make you want to headbang and smash the state. Off the same label and from Germany, we've got Lidovisk. And this is my sort of goth adjacent or punk adjacent recommendation to kind of mix things up if you're looking for something different. So on this album, you get a vocal that reminds me more of oi punk vocals than anything else. Lyrically, the album isn't in English most of the time, but the Bandcamp page states, quote, "The teenage years are those of endless summers where feelings and taste for freedom enter a new dimension." Lidovisk takes a look at this period, but also on its commitment to activism and questions its relationship to others, social determinism, and religious faith, unquote. The music ranges from bouncy, aggressive melodic punk to an introspective, romantic, almost kind of like alt-rock or pop punk. But yeah, I really enjoyed the album, so I wanted to share it. Since we are heading toward the outer edges of the scene, the next recommendation is from Belgium-based collective Plague Pits. Their new album addresses topics such as the climate crisis and the dehumanizing effects of neoliberalism. Musically, they alternate between synth-pop-inspired electronic beats that are infused with 80s sensibilities like Devo and Gary Newman and Visage. The album is generally pretty minimal, so you'll get a vocal, a couple layered synths, and sound effects on top of that. It's angular, distinctive, nostalgic, and dancey as fuck. Long-running Berlin band 6th June returned with a new single called Dance With Me. It's a return to their signature sound, or at least what I would consider their signature sound. Wistful, longing, and morose. Dance With Me is an experiment in unreality, in the sort of severing of the mind from the body to travel across a plane of the incorporeal while longing to be whole. Well, that's at least how it makes me feel. I always viewed 6th June as a kind of art house post-punk band. I know they tend to market themselves that way, so that's not a surprise, but I'm always interested to hear what unique twist on familiar territory they come up with, and the new single definitely doesn't disappoint. Finally, from Mexico, we have a series of singles released by Dancing Strangers, the most recent of which is Another Night, which is this fantastic Joy Division-esque track. You get this great funk-inspired bass guitar at the forefront, supported by a kind of new wave synth line with droning, monotonous, kind of robotic, deep vocals. As the track moves on, you get a couple quick breakdowns, which are kind of like new wave inspired, and then a femme vocal finds its way into the track with a very ethereal, dreamy sound that provides a lovely contrast. Their other singles are all different, leaning into either electronics or rock, but in very different ways and very different forms. I only recently discovered this band, and I'm absolutely in love with what I've heard so far. That's it for my Sinister Suggestions. We're going to move on into Azibat's All Goth Considered, and I will see you on the other side.
Greetings, I'm Azzy, and you're listening to the April 2023 edition of All Goth Considered with Obscura Undead. In this segment, we explore 3 recent singles and releases and hear what the artists have to say about their music. So refill your wine glass, or teacup in my case, and let's dive into these dark waters together. We're visiting New York City first to catch up with Matthew McIntosh and Beth Narducci of A Cloud of Raves. I've been very excited about this spooky duo since their debut release in 2019. They have this beautiful bleak darkwave sound that often spins into some of the most bombastic goth rock, so that was instant love for me since day one. Ian has a beautiful tenor that is beyond enchanting. Their use of synths is lovely, and Beth's bass lines are just so rich. And fun fact, Beth and I play the same style of short chord Fender, I believe. Their latest single, Parable, is the fourth and final track on their upcoming album Lost Hymns, releasing April 28th, 2023, and it's an absolute treat. You can catch them on tour this spring, supporting Then Come Silence on their European tour, and Clan of Zymox and Curse Mackie in the US. Let's hear from them about their latest single.
Hey Azzy, thank you for reaching out. When we were recording the new album, Lost Hymns, we really wanted to try to stretch a little from the last record creatively. I had a few songs that I'd written years ago before, we were even doing A Cloud of Raves. And one of two that ended up on the album was Parable. Initially, I'd played it for Beth, and I was like, what do you think? Is this a Raven song? And she was like, yeah, it definitely could be. And what ended up on the album is fairly true to the earliest version of it, even lyrically, which it kind of channels Einstein's definition of insanity, which is, doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. So the song, even though it's kind of dense in metaphor, is essentially asking, how sideways does shit need to get in this world for us to realize, as a society, culturally, that maybe, something needs to shift here as far as how we treat each other, honoring each other's lifestyle choices, the futility of war, how we treat the environment. It's like we got one planet here and we're all stuck on it together, whether we like it or not. And maybe it's oversimplifying, but doesn't the path of least resistance kind of make the most sense here ultimately? So if the song's got a message, it's that. But all said, the best comment I've gotten about Parable was I sent it to Bruce from the band Sequential Zero, and he said, it's great, man. It sounds like a gothic Alphaville. I was like, oh, that's perfect.
Next, we're headed across the Atlantic to Bern in Zurich, Switzerland. Here, the music collective Plague Pits has been self-releasing tracks that capture the vibe of early DIY analog electronic tapes with sparse synth beats, industrial-esque, like think Kraftwerk style samples, simple melodies, synth loops, and layers. So many layers. Their music really is deceptively simple, but lyrically addresses contemporary issues that are, forecasting a bleak future. Their latest release on March 3rd, 2023, Punishment and Extinction, is an anthology of standout tracks from their discography, with all proceeds going to Mission Lifeline, which rescues refugees in the Mediterranean Sea. The track I'm featuring this week is one of my favorites, The Numinous.
Okay, hello everybody, this is Tommy from Plague Pits. I have the privilege to speak here a little bit about one of our songs, and the track in question is called The Numinous, and it was released about a year ago on our third EP of the same name. The numinous, the word refers to a sort of mystical experience or a sense of the presence of the divine. And the numinous, the song, is about how neoliberalism is, at its core, a sort of mystical doctrine that has been sold to us as just a neutral description of how the world works. And the market is seen in there as a thing with a will of its own that operates based on an inherent knowledge that is unattainable to mere humans, and that all we can do is remove its restraints, and it will then maximize the wealth and well-being of the human race, or at least of those humans who prove their worth in competition with others. And if the rest falls by the wayside, that's just collateral damage. The world leaders, politicians, economists, entrepreneurs that do its bidding have been anointed by the touch of the market's invisible hand and sort of handed down these stone tablets from the mountaintop. So the market means everything, and as it says in the song, your life means nothing.
from one mountain range to another. Next up is WitchHands. This band is a full death rock outfit from Colorado Springs, Colorado, and this 5-piece has built themselves a sizable following on the West Coast since 2016 with their style that ranges into punk and goth rock, their energetic stage presence, and their ability to connect with live crowds. I've only watched their live performances on YouTube, but I'm excited to see them perform in Colorado in May on their mini tour supporting Ausgang. I've had the pleasure of hearing their upcoming album, No Gods, No Masters, releasing April 15th on Batcave Productions. And side note, check out Danny's Patreon interview with frontman Ryan Flint and subscribe to Obscure Undead on YouTube so you don't miss my upcoming track-by-track breakdown with Ryan Flint. I've been given permission to give you all a peek, a sneak peek, a Pike's peek, sneak Pike's peek. I'm so sorry. At my favorite track, Cain's Harvest. Let's hear more from the fanciest of lads, Ryan Flint.
Greetings, ghouls, goths, goblins, and assorted children of the night. I'm Ryan Flint, singer for WitchHands. Cain's Harvest was the first song we wrote for the album. After learning enough old songs to play out, everything fell into place, and this fell out. Wrote itself, almost. Typically, the band writes an instrumental that I sit in on. I play guitar to feel out melodic ideas. When it's roughly structured, about 80% complete, I sit down and start crafting full pages of lyrics. On this one, our new guitarist / old bassist Adjudication was inspired by the Cult. So I got to lean more into a ballad and epic singing and imagery. This song deals in part with what anthropologists refer to as the original sin of civilization, the leaving Eden of agriculture, when we stopped living like animals in the wild, hunting and gathering, and started to build cities and excesses and society, armies and art. And with all of these walls, we nurtured the delusion that we were apart from nature, when in fact it was all built on the foundation of growing seeds and the rain. With all of the extra time afforded to us and our specialties, we start striving for perfection, but we fall short. We are gifted life by mothers. We live, we kill, we die, we take, we are taken, we bloom and fade away. The title comes from Cain, allegedly the first farmer, the first killer, and a real motherfucker. The song is Cain's Harvest.
Thank you for listening. For more, please follow us on most major social media platforms under the handle Obscura Undead. Take care of yourselves. Love you. I am so sorry for my voice. It is my lungs loaded with Ren Fair dust. But bye-bye.
Azzy, thank you for your 6th contribution to the Cemetery Confessions podcast. You are, I think, officially an institution on the show now. It's really an honor to have you here and sharing your content with us. If you haven't already, definitely go check out the Obscura Undead YouTube channel and take a listen to the new music that they put out in the form of mixes, the album reviews, and all the other kind of content they have. They put out compilations on Bandcamp and a zine occasionally, all kinds of fantastic things. Well, I hope this episode was enjoyable and meaningful for more than just the 3 of us who were on the main discussion. I know it was, again, a challenging topic, and honestly, there was so much more to talk about. We could have easily done an additional 2-hour conversation and more. And I would enjoy doing that, but I understand that's likely not necessarily the cup of tea everyone is interested in. Of course, if you are, feel free to let me know. Maybe we'll find a way to do this again in the future, or at least for Patreon, perhaps. And actually, if you are looking for more content, want to listen to an episode about goth music, right, about the scene, like I mentioned, go ahead and check out patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions. We had Ryan on from WitchHands to talk through track by track the meaning behind each of the songs on No Gods, No Masters. And, those conversations spun off into some fantastic stories about discovering goth and the substance of goth, and in a lot of interesting ways that I thought were incredibly worthwhile. And I was really honored to have him on and share such a depth of knowledge and passion. So if you're interested in that, go head over to the page, check it out. I will just say, these episodes are a labor of love and take a lot out of me and a lot out of my life, right? I probably on average spend about 30 hours a week on the podcast, which seems like a lot, but I mean, it is. And I do it to try and make this the best possible show that it can be. So if you're able, things like jumping on Patreon or grabbing a vial of Cemetery Confessions perfume oil, right? Those things enable us to continue the podcast. And thank you all so much for everyone who continues to support us on Patreon. Obviously, we have a big back catalog of exclusive content, and I hope to create more exclusive content in the future. Listening back to this interview was amusing to me because I kept asking these sort of, as Paulo pointed out, abstract, big picture questions about these large heterogeneous groups, these, theoretical people and situations. And Paulo kept trying to claw and drag me back into specificity, which I think is important, right? Because that's what I talk about on the show whenever we get into these discussions around, well, somebody was complaining online about how Instagram influencers are the death of goth, or online about how people who listen to Lil Peep and think that's a goth band or whatever are ruining the scene, or Killstar is influencers are ruining the scene, and I always try and pull people back. And in fact, my video on YouTube that I did last year about the internet hasn't killed goth yet, I believe is what it's titled, is in large part about that very thing, that question, who are we talking about? Is this an abstracted group of people that have no basis in material reality, that we are just creating, pulling images and experiences and indirect inferences about social media profiles and conglomerating them into this homogenous group that is actually in no way homogenous when you really actually get down to it, and trying to say, think about this. Talk to these people. Who is this person? Ask them, what are their material circumstances? What are their past experiences? Who are the people around them? What is their access to information? What are their interests? Who have they talked to about goth? What have they read about goth? Ask them questions. What do you think about thinking about goth this way? Why do you think about goth that way, right? Get down to an actual person and learn about them. Very quickly, you will see that the boogeyman disappears, and this convenient scapegoat is illusory in a lot of ways. And so I try and make that point, and I thought it was, listening back to this, funny that the shoe was sort of on the other foot in this instance, where I wanted to keep referencing these theoretical scenarios and these amalgams, these abstracted groups. So it's very easy to do, and I still do it. But I think that is one of the important takeaways of this episode. And so, yeah, I think if you've made it this far into this lengthy episode, I feel an ease of conversation here, because you're one of the people who listen likely every month and listen through the entire show. So I'm curious to see what the reaction to this is. It seemed like our episode From Sound to Subculture did pretty well, relatively. I generally don't look at or care about metrics. Every once in a long while, I'll just take a look out of curiosity. But the last time I looked, From Sound to Subculture did fairly well, which was honestly surprising to me considering the dense subject matter. But that was also, I think, more directly referencing continuously throughout the episode goth music and goth culture. So I'm honestly not certain how this episode will come across. It is a bit of a risk, but like I said, I think that diversity of content is what makes this podcast interesting, and something that isn't really replicated in other places. So I honestly take pride in that, and I suppose I take comfort in the fact that if this wasn't an episode for you, there are a back catalog of episodes that may be for you, and there's content on Patreon as well that I think is worthwhile. So yeah, I don't know. I suppose after this episode, I'm feeling a bit reflective. And certainly that's something that has been a prominent theme in my life the last couple months for a variety of reasons. But there's been a lot of personal reflection, modification to perspectives and behaviors in the pursuit of personal growth and the flourishing of my family and friendships. So I won't get too much into that, but maybe I'll do a Patreon video on it if there's interest. Well, with that, I guess navel gazing out of the way, I think it's time to wrap up the episode. I know I say this every episode, but I genuinely mean from the bottom of my heart when I say thank you. It's not an empty platitude. It fills my heart with love and has gotten me through some bad times as well, knowing that there are people out there who enjoy and support what we are doing and trying to do here. So sincerely thank you for everything and for just being here. For being around, for persisting, and for choosing to spend your time with me. Thank you for allowing me to share in the inaction of your ontological world. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.